Considered one of the most perplexing mysteries to occur during World War II. Considered one of the most perplexing mysteries to occur during World War II. Considered one of the most perplexing mysteries to occur during World War II. On the morning of August 16, 1942, two U.S. naval pilots seemingly disappeared without trace from the cabin of their dirigible airship while conducting a routine flight off the coast of California. What could have caused two highly trained military men, both of sound mind and body, to abandon an airworthy ship in mid-flight? This is the story of the Ghost Blimp. World War II is arguably one of the most documented and revisited wars from history. However, many of the events that took place during this war remain secluded from the purview of many Americans. Some may be surprised to hear that both Japanese and German naval forces conducted attacks near or on the U.S. mainland, primarily against American ships along its Atlantic and Pacific coastlines. While a series of following events would result in the unusual disappearance of two U.S. blimp pilots later in August, Japanese submarine activity likewise resulted in another mysterious loss on December 7, 1941, that of a number of merchant marines and soldiers far out at sea. 10 minutes before the attack began on Pearl Harbor, 1,200 miles away, a Japanese I-class submarine surfaced and opened fire on the SS Cynthia Olsen, a U.S. Army lumber freighter, midway on her route between Washington State and Hawaii. After dozens of shells fired from the submarine's deck gun hit their mark, the Olsen became the first U.S. ship to be sunk by the Japanese Empire. The last to see them alive, Japanese records report that the captain of the attacking sub later surfaced and provided food rations to the surviving Americans in their lifeboats. However, despite the Olsen's radio operator remaining on the ship and successfully transmitting their final position to nearby ships and shore stations, none of the 35 crew members were ever seen again. Prior to the start of the attack on Oahu, Japanese submarines were positioned near the entrance of Pearl Harbor in order to intercept any American vessels attempting to maneuver out into open water. 3 days later, 9 of the available 12 Japanese submarines were then instructed to pursue and sink an American aircraft carrier on its way to the U.S. mainland. They were then to move to strategic attack points, harbor entrances, and shipping lanes along the U.S. shoreline. Over the following week, from December 18th to the 24th, Americans would witness a number of Japanese attacks on U.S. merchant vessels, very near the shores of California. The submarines would remain on location, prowling the coastline until the last week of February. During this time, at least half a dozen American merchant and cargo vessels were attacked, with a number of their crew members being killed or abandoning their sinking ships, some with their lifeboats then riddled by Japanese deck guns. Although the Japanese had initially planned to bombard American coastal cities such as Los Angeles, submarine commanders feared the Americans' increasingly accurate anti-submarine retaliations. The only land target to be attacked was the Elwood oil refinery, located about 80 miles northwest of Los Angeles, near Santa Barbara. As many Americans now feared mainland attacks during the uncertain conflict, the United States Navy proposed to Congress the development of a lighter-than-air program for routine anti-submarine patrolling of the coast and harbors. Equipped with 2 Mark 17 depth bombs and a .30 caliber machine gun, these airships were more than capable of sinking any Japanese subs they might locate. By August of 1942, dirigible patrols had become a common observance along California's coastline. However, in the late morning of August 16th, as a lone swimmer prepared to enter the water, he was startled to see a blimp emerging from the now dissipating morning fog, flying dangerously low over the water, right toward his position. Quickly moving out of harm's way, he watched as the airship bounced off of the sand, then careened into a steep embankment. One of its 2 depth charges broke away on impact. Now free from the weight of the charge, it lifted into the sky and drifted back out of sight. Thousands of eyewitnesses soon watched as this crippled airship now listed slowly over the San Francisco peninsula. With its helium bag leaking, it eventually descended to the ground, grazing several rooftops and power lines before landing in the street on the northeast end of Daly City. Having pursued the drifting airship for some time, firefighters, police, and city officials arrived quickly on the location, joined by other residents and curious observers. An immediate search baffled the investigators. The blimp was missing its crew. The door had been latched open, a microphone hooked to an external loudspeaker dangling out of the open hatch. Aside from the damage to one of the engines during its several impacts, nothing about the ship was out of order. The engine was on, and the throttle was set to the idling position. The radio was turned on and in working condition. The life raft and 3 parachutes were still in the cabin on their hooks. There was no apparent evidence of foul play. The airship, referred to by its designated number, or as Love 8, had departed the nearby naval station Treasure Island shortly after 6 a.m. that same morning, piloted by 27-year-old Lieutenant Ernest Cody and 32-year-old Ensign Charles Adams. Both were considered skillful flyers. The first hour and a half of flight was uneventful, taking them over the Golden Gate Bridge, out over open water, towards the small Farallon Islands, 30 miles offshore. At 7:38, when they were within 4 miles of the islands, the men radioed their position. A few minutes later, having spotted a suspicious oil slick, a possible indication of Japanese submarine activity, they alerted their squadron's headquarters of their intent to investigate it. This was the last anyone ever heard from either of these men. Crew members aboard 2 ships floating nearby the location of the reported oil slick, a cargo ship named the SS Albert Gallatin and a fishing trawler named the Daisy Gray, later reported their eyewitness accounts in lieu of Cody and Adams' inexplicable radio silence. At about the same time, Love 8's pilots had radioed their investigation of the oil slick, 7:42 a.m. Both ships witnessed 2 smoke flares drop from the blimp into the water. The pilots would have used these flares to mark a spot of interest, for instance, the location of an enemy submarine, which could then be targeted by American bomber planes. The Gallatin crew immediately sounded an alarm and manned their deck guns, quickly moving their ship away from the area in case there was a submarine. The Daisy Gray was much closer, enough for the first mate to see the 2 pilots inside the gondola and even distinguish their hair color. They immediately began reeling in their fishing nets in anticipation of the airship dropping a depth charge onto an enemy sub. There were no bombs dropped. In fact, while they remained in place watching the blimp, none of the now keenly observant Daisy Gray crew saw anything fall from the aircraft other than the 2 initial flares. For over an hour they watched in trepidation, some with binoculars, as the blimp continued to circle the location between 200 and 300 feet over the water. At one point, the airship descended to less than 30 feet above the waves, as if its crew wanted a closer look. Men on the now departing SS Gallatin said it looked as though it was almost sitting on top of the water. Then, shortly after 9 a.m., Love 8 dropped ballast, rose, and headed back toward San Francisco. Since blimps so regularly patrolled the coastline, nobody watching thought LA's movement seemed unusual. But that was possibly the last time Cody and Adams were ever seen. For some reason, the pilots had maintained radio silence during this hour and a half. Their command back at base was growing concerned. presumably in an uncontrolled manner, since both pilots may have fallen out while the blimp idled over the oil slick. Yet this seems unlikely for a number of reasons, including that the blimp was witnessed as flying in a controlled manner, and there do appear to be multiple sightings of the blimp between these 2 points in time. An hour and a half after departing the oil slick, at 10:49 a.m., the pilot of a Pan American Clipper plane reported seeing the blimp flying over the Golden Gate Bridge. Nothing seemed unusual. L8 appeared to be under control and heading back in the direction of Treasure Island. It is possible that a nearby P-38 pilot also reported seeing her nearing the bridge around the same time. However, no given timestamp appears to exist for the P-38 pilot's report, and other retellings of this story seem to simply include this particular sighting as an afterthought. The P-38 pilot apparently reported the same information as the Clipper pilot. The blimp was flying normally, nothing unusual. If these 2 sightings near the bridge are in fact true, L8's next reported sighting is then almost impossible to comprehend. The Kingfisher float planes, presumably still searching along Love 8's originally planned route over open ocean, were possibly then informed that the blimp was spotted near the bridge and redirected their course in that direction to get eyes on for themselves. At 11 a.m., 10 minutes after being seen over the Golden Gate Bridge, one of the Kingfisher pilots finally spotted the blimp. Strangely, Love 8 was nowhere near where her previously reported flight path should have taken her. The Kingfisher pilot further stated that the blimp was acting unusually, as it was now rising from the overcast, disappearing into the cloud cover at nearly 2,000 feet when he spotted it. That day's weather conditions would have meant the blimp's automated pressure release valves would activate somewhere between 2,100 and 2,500 feet. Once the maximum altitude had caused enough of its helium to be vented, the now crumpled airship then would have descended. If accurate, this reported sighting by the Kingfisher pilot is bizarre. Despite having just been reported as flying east over the Golden Gate Bridge, back towards Treasure Island, L8 now appeared to have doubled back, as she was now almost 15 miles southwest from the bridge, 3 miles offshore, over the Pacific Ocean. While some minutes must be accounted for in the delay of the previous radio transmissions, the reported times of these sightings and Love 8's inexplicable changes in flight pattern are seemingly impossible, as if the blimp was suddenly capable of moving at incredibly high speeds, or that it could be in 2 places at once. When departing and returning from the Farallon Islands, for the trip to have taken an hour and a half in both directions, from just after 6 a.m. until 7:42, and then its return starting just after 9 a.m. until 10:49, the blimp would have been traveling at a low cruising speed of around 20 miles per hour. At least on the first leg of the trip, out to the islands, this is a logical speed for the pilot to have maintained. If not only to conserve fuel, they would have wanted to move at a speed slow enough that would allow them to observe the water below them for enemy submarines. It is unknown whether the pilots were still aboard when the blimp was heading back towards land. However, since it was later found with the engines set to idle, it is not clear how the blimp could have maintained a consistent 20-mile-per-hour speed on the trip back, unless there were strong enough winds, or unless it was in fact being piloted. In any case, L8's maximum airspeed was just over 60 miles per hour, in excellent weather conditions. For the blimp to have traveled 15 miles southwest of the Golden Gate Bridge in less than 10 minutes, it would have to be moving at a speed of somewhere between 85 to nearly 100 miles per hour, which would have been impossible. If the Kingfisher pilot's reporting is accurate, and L8 was 3 miles off of Solana Beach at that time, it then apparently again reversed course, drifting over 6 miles back northeast. This movement, at least, is presumably an accurate assumption, since strong winds may have pushed the idling and now deflated blimp inland until it eventually struck Ocean Beach. When it later crashed in Daly City, the blimp was found with only 4 hours of fuel remaining. Having started her patrol with 12 hours worth of fuel, the only rational explanation is that at some point, one of the pilots intentionally dumped over 30% of the airship's fuel. But why? This procedure was considered highly unusual, unless for some reason the blimp needed to rise in a hurry by suddenly and drastically increasing buoyancy. This substantial fuel dump may explain why the blimp was seen disappearing high into the cloud ceiling like a child's balloon, meaning the loss of fuel then occurred sometime between 10:49 and 11 a.m., while the airship somehow traveled the impossible distance from the Golden Gate Bridge to 3 miles off of Salada Beach. This increased buoyancy could further be explained by the loss of the 2 men on board, although multiple eyewitness accounts appear to contradict this notion. Those individuals claim to have seen men moving around inside the gondola even after the blimp was already deflated and drifting offshore. As our minds attempt to make sense of this mystery, many will gravitate to the commonly suggested theory that, due to a number of possible causes, at some point one of the men fell from the gondola, possibly occurring at the site of the oil slick. This could explain the aircraft circling low over the water for over an hour. As the door was latched open with a loudspeaker handset dangling out of it, the remaining pilot may then have been leaning out of the door, using the loudspeaker to attempt to locate or communicate with the fallen man, now in the water. The second man then possibly fell when he either lost his grip on the gondola or otherwise falling during his attempts to locate and rescue his companion. As the waters surrounding the Farallon Islands appear to attract one of the largest aggregations of great white sharks in the world, arguably, these waters are dangerous enough for anyone to fall into, even if they did survive the impact and were wearing a life jacket. Though clearly the most plausible explanation, this theory begins to fall apart due to conflicting eyewitness reports, especially those of the blimp's seemingly controlled flight pattern back towards San Francisco, as witnessed by the Daisy Gray and the pilots who spotted her near the Golden Gate Bridge. In addition, some have suggested that the 2 flares were dropped not to mark an enemy submarine, but to mark the position of the first man who had fallen. While logical, this theory is contradicted by the Daisy Gray crew, reporting that the flares dropped at 7:42 a.m., approximately the same time that one of the men was also radioing their base command, informing them of the oil slick. Even further, journalists interviewed several individuals who witnessed the airship in the sky, appearing wilted as it aimlessly drifted 50 feet over the water offshore. At least 2 separate individuals, a 17-year-old boy at an unknown location, and a young woman riding horseback near the beach where the blimp first crashed, tracked its slow movement to the beach with their binoculars and claimed they could see figures moving inside the cabin. The woman stated she was quite sure she saw at least 3 men inside. Still more contradicting are the reports, one from the golf course near where the blimp crashed into the beach, that a man was seen parachuting out of Love 8 while still over the water. Moreover, the Navy issued a statement that their investigation showed no possibility of the men being in the craft at any time during its derelict flight over land. Another theory is that the pilots had in fact spotted an enemy Japanese sub and descended to investigate it. It is speculated that they were then captured and either killed or taken prisoner on board the submarine. The first question is why they would have not instead immediately dropped their depth charges rather than risk such a dangerous and seemingly pointless investigation. And if this theory were true, who flew the blimp back to San Francisco, as witnessed by the crew members on the Daisy Gray and the pilots who spotted Love 8 nearing the bridge? Another theory is that the 2 men were involved in a lover's triangle with an unknown woman. According to this theory, one had murdered the other in a jealous rage and then fled when the blimp reached land. This theory, too, seems an implausible dramatization. Although the intentional or unintentional murder of one of the pilots gives credibility as to how one of them may have initially fallen, it fails to explain the eyewitness accounts, the strange movements of the airship, and at what point the second pilot could have escaped the craft while airborne. If this were remotely true, then he may have jumped to his death out of guilt, or possibly survived the jump into water, and spent the rest of his life hiding in exile for fear of the consequences. The most contradicting aspect of this latter theory is to ask why the offending pilot would not simply explain his companion's death as an accident. More inexplicable suggestions are that both men were working together on a scheme to go AWOL, abandoning their military duty, or that they may have been spying for the Japanese. Possibly the most sensational is that they were in fact abducted from their craft by alien intervention. A theory that does not appear to have yet been suggested is the paranormal theory of dimensional or time slippage. 3 years after the disappearance of Love 8's pilots, 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers, designated Flight 19, took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and failed to ever return. Those pilots reported experiencing compass malfunctions and disorientation prior to their final radio transmissions. If Love 8's radio was found to be working, and the pilots were on board the airship, why would they have maintained radio silence, unless there was possible electromagnetic interference with their transmissions? Could the airship's seemingly impossible movement over the Golden Gate Bridge, to where it was then seen miles away drifting over the clouds, be explained by a dimensional shift? And as the men seemed to disappear, or even reappear with an additional companion inside the gondola, does their possible movement between dimensions compare to that of other urban legends, such as in 1954, when a man arrived by plane in Tokyo, an unknown country called Toddler, later mysteriously disappearing out of a laundry while being held in Japanese police custody? As with the specific location of such myths as the Bermuda Triangle, what if the Farallon Islands, known also as the Devil's Teeth, have some form of paranormal influence of their own? As of today, Ernest Cody and Charles Adams are not the only men to mysteriously disappear in proximity to these small rocky islands off the shores of San Francisco. Jim Gray was and remains a commemorated computer scientist, having received the Alan Turing Award in 1998 for his significant contributions to global computer systems. He was also an experienced sailor. On a calm, clear weather day in early 2007, he notified his family that he intended to sail to the Farallon Islands to scatter his mother's ashes. Like Cody and Adams, he was never seen again. As with Love 8's pilots, an extensive Coast Guard search of nearly 132,000 square miles of ocean turned up nothing. Advanced sonar scanning of 300 square miles of ocean floor between the Golden Gate Bridge and the islands turned up several wrecked ships. An underwater robotic camera confirmed that none were Jim's sailboat. Questions are raised as to why, if he was shipwrecked, he did not radio a distress signal. Further to this, the Coast Guard confirmed his ship would have been equipped with an emergency GPS beacon, which should have activated when exposed to seawater. No signal was ever received, nor has any firm explanation been determined as to how an experienced sailor and a 40-foot sailboat could simply disappear. While nearly all explanations for these and other such mysterious disappearances often produce more questions than they answer, ultimately, we find our thoughts with the families and loved ones of the lost. It is they who will possibly spend their years wondering what truly happened, far beyond what can be said of any of our own curiosities. We wish nothing but fair winds and following seas to these men. May their families find peace. By 1965, the Viet Cong had expanded a pre-existing labyrinth of tunnels and underground chambers beneath their villages and the surrounding jungle. For nearly 8 years, they practically lived in this network of subterranean cities as they waged a war of endurance against South Vietnamese forces and their allies. Thousands of miles from their own homes and families, the Allied soldiers and Marines who daringly entered into these claustrophobic passages were met with complete darkness, the smell of damp earth and rotting corpses, vicious booby traps, and enemy soldiers lying in wait. This is the story of the Viet Cong tunnels. Known by the Vietnamese as the American War, this conflict is still mired in heated political debate. Therefore, understanding why this war was fought, why the Vietnamese spent over 20 years digging tens of thousands of kilometers of underground tunnels, requires a degree of understanding the root causes of the war itself, or, more precisely, the question of why millions of Vietnamese citizens found themselves in the crossfire as the armies of the French, Japanese, and then Allied forces destroyed each other in the dense jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam. Invaded in the mid-19th century by Napoleon's forces, like so many other nations, Vietnam entered a long-standing fight to regain its independence from foreign exploitation and oppression. Despite their initial defeat against expanding French colonization, remnants of the Vietnamese armies began a campaign of guerrilla fighting through the 1860s, a time when armed conflict raged worldwide, from the New Zealand Wars to the Americans fighting a civil war half a world away. Through the end of the Second World War, a lack of sufficient organization appears to have caused the repeated failure of Vietnamese anti-colonial uprisings against the now established French government. With the fall of Chinese dynastic rule at the turn of the century, the subsequent rise of communism and its literary edification by Lenin and other pro-communist intellectual writers, it was during the 1930s that a man known as Ho Chi Minh was inspired by communism and successfully organized support of the ideology in northern Vietnam. Taking advantage of the working class's hatred of the oppressive French government and of the invading Japanese, this newly founded Communist Party began recruiting a guerrilla army. All they needed was an opportunity, which the end of World War II provided. Following the surrender of the Japanese Empire in 1945, the confusion of ruling powers left behind in Vietnam allowed Minh's Communist Party to seize control of the northern region, uniting into an alliance known as the Viet Minh. Viet Minh fighters and other pro-communists joined to form the Viet Cong. They rekindled the guerrilla war against French forces, who were now attempting to regain their dominance of the region. Tunnels were dug under the scattered South Vietnamese villages and hamlets, not only to disguise the coordinated Viet Cong movements, but for innocent villagers to escape capture, interrogation, and execution during the French military's sweeping raids through the region. With casualties mounting on all sides, a treaty agreement was attempted in 1954. Vietnam was then divided at the 17th parallel into the Communist North and the non-Communist South. During this temporary peace, more than 1 million Vietnamese civilians, soldiers, Catholics, and other anti-communists fled the despotism of North Vietnamese policy with assistance from the US and Allied forces. Meanwhile, pro-communists who remained in South Vietnam, as well as Buddhists and those who supported Vietnamese independence, continued to experience tyranny under corrupted French governance in the South. The promise of French democracy had quickly devolved into dictatorship. The peace was short-lived. Irreconcilable differences between the North and the South led to continued fighting, as most Vietnamese people wanted total independence, whether communist or not, while the French continued to push for re-establishing complete colonial control. From 1963 to 1965, the North injected an additional 150,000 Viet Cong guerrilla fighters into the southern region in an effort to overthrow the French government once and for all. Civilian casualties continued to mount. Those unfortunate souls who resided in South Vietnam and supported neither regime in favor of a republican democracy suffered political and religious persecution. They were now executed and abused by both the Viet Cong and the French government. Increasing involvement by French allies amongst them, the least. The Allied forces' primary goal was to halt the spread of communism in Asia, believing in a domino theory. If Vietnam fell, as China and North Korea had, others would soon follow. Operation Rolling Thunder was the initial effort to discourage communist aggression and stamp out the infiltrations of Viet Cong troops and their supplies entering South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Beginning in 1965, American forces began a 3-year campaign of heavy aerial and artillery bombardment. American troops who were stationed in Vietnam at the time report that the ground shook so violently during the routine bombing, they did not even have to stir their morning coffee. Tens of thousands more civilians were killed as a result of this American effort to destroy the Vietnamese jungle and its dense foliage with a relentless dropping of explosives, destructive herbicides, predominantly Agent Orange, and napalm. The villagers of Viet Cong dug their tunnels even deeper to survive the obliteration of the earth above them. Realizing the insufficiency of these attritional bombing efforts, and on the apparently falsified premise of a North Vietnamese attack against an American ship in the Gulf of Tonkin, American leaders began pouring troops into Vietnam, reaching nearly 500,000 by the end of 1968, partnering with an existing force of some 600,000 South Vietnamese troops. Additionally, these were joined by smaller military contingents from Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and South Korea. For some time during their initial movements into Vietnam, Allied troops felt as if they were fighting an invisible enemy, completely unaware of the expansive network of fortified Viet Cong tunnels underneath their very feet. Tunnels were even dug underneath American military installations, allowing for surprise attacks to occur within their guarded perimeters. Many tunnel openings, trenches, and battle posts were strategically built along tree lines, concealed by brush and high grass, a tactic which fooled Allied fighters. Many unsuspecting troops were killed so close to the tunnel entrances. VC fighters, known phonetically by Americans as Victor Charlies, could easily retrieve weapons from the fallen troops without being noticed. Advancing forces were then startled at how the enemy could have appeared and then disappeared so quickly. Unable to see the tunnel openings, they assumed the gunfire was coming from deeper within the jungle or from nearby villages. Without ever encountering a single Viet Cong fighter, daily patrols suffered numerous casualties, as the terrain was littered with tens of thousands of concealed booby traps. Over 11% of the Allied deaths were caused by these traps, with thousands more survivors still maimed and injured for life. Explosive mines were buried in the ground, or otherwise attached to tripwires, devilishly placed. Some were even hidden amongst attractive flowers, which Americans were known to pick, or otherwise attached to irresistible souvenir items like Viet Cong flags and weapons. Tripwires caused tiger traps, heavy objects covered in long spikes, to fall from trees. The most effective traps were the large concealed pits filled with sharpened bamboo or steel spikes. Impaled through their feet, legs, and torsos, even if victims survived the horrific injuries, the sticks were often coated with animal and human feces or plant poisons, left to fester in the sweltering heat of the tropical climate. Some of the large, spiked metal traps were designed in order to cause even worse damage if a soldier attempted to remove them. The wounded men then had to be carried away, along with the trap. The Allied troops' primary mission was search and destroy, locate and either kill or capture the enemy. Unlike other wars, when troops in Vietnam defeated the enemy in a certain area, they would not remain there. After they soon departed, the enemy would move back into their tunnels, which remained full of supplies and munitions, quickly re-establishing their fighting positions. Many Allied soldiers and Vietnamese would die, seemingly pointlessly, fighting repeatedly over the same piece of land. Unbeknownst to many Allied troops, the Vietnamese were just as persistent as they, entirely willing to fight to the last man. In frustration, some among the Allied soldiers resorted to more gruesome tactics, such as the decapitation of Viet Cong corpses, stuffing an ace of spades card in the mouth, and then displaying the severed head to prevent the superstitious enemy from returning to the area. Since they were unable to visualize a victory over ground, Allied troops began reporting body counts, the number of dead enemy fighters, so they could determine some form of progress in a seemingly endless fight. While seen as grotesque by many of their peers, some American fighters went so far as to cut an ear from every man they killed, displaying these trophies on necklaces or keychains. The Viet Cong had their own versions of debauchery, as they would award honored titles, such as American Destroyer Hero, to their fighters who succeeded in killing a certain number of Allied troops. In an act of twisted generosity, some fighters with excess kill counts would even offer their extra kills to a friend, so they could both receive a promotional title. Regardless of the violence and booby traps, the foreign Allied fighters battled with the unfamiliar environment itself, enduring humid temperatures over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, thick jungle and razor-sharp plants, plagues of mosquitoes, centipedes, and other biting insects, poisonous snakes, and festering wounds from leeches. When they did encounter enemy soldiers, it was by sporadic ambushes, sniper fire snapping by their ears like so many steel mosquitoes. As Allied casualties mounted, so did their frustration. They rarely found themselves with an opportunity to fire back, unable to see the guerrilla fighters firing from their concealed tunnel entrances. During jungle firefights, it was not uncommon for Allied fighters to inadvertently shoot and kill their friends as they began firing in all directions, not knowing from where they were being attacked. Other Allied soldiers report that while patrolling in the dark jungle, they would see nothing but empty and quiet forest, only to glance behind them, shocked, to find dozens of Viet Cong. Mounting uncertainty, known as the fog of war, led to heightened suspicions and paranoia among Allied troops. The only people they could see were the villagers themselves, the local Vietnamese, especially those young men and women of fighting age, residing in the grass and bamboo villages they passed through as they received enemy fire from unknown locations. Since many tunnel entrances could be found in and around the villages, Viet Cong fighters often used this concealment to initiate firefights. Despite many of the Allied troops' better judgments, confused at how to fight an otherwise unseen enemy, the only available course of action at times appeared to be destroying the villages, setting fire to them, or calling for airstrikes. A hellish landscape of increasing civilian casualties began to unfold. Though innocent civilians were often caught in the crossfire, many villagers were indeed Viet Cong fighters. Otherwise, they may have been the aging parents, spouses, or children of communist fighters, who loyally supported the Viet Cong how they could. Many stories from Allied troops tell of friendly villagers offering to clean their laundry or provide them meals during the daytime, only to be caught attempting to slit an American's throat later that night, or otherwise their bodies being recognized among the Viet Cong dead after an intense firefight. Yet any villagers who opposed the Viet Cong now found themselves under suspicion, arrested, beaten, tortured, interrogated, and murdered, their homes and land destroyed by both Allied and Viet Cong soldiers. They soon grew to hate the Allied troops as much as they did the communists. In early 1966, almost an entire year after they began arriving in Vietnam, a combined party of Australian and American troops were engaging the Viet Cong in an immense firefight near a rubber plantation about 25 miles northwest of Saigon. As with previous skirmishes, they combed the area, finding evidence of a company-sized group of enemy fighters, at least 100 men. Frustratingly, they had again seemingly vanished into thin air. Taking a moment to rest, Sergeant Stuart Green sat on the ground. Shouting with pain, he immediately jumped up, as if he had been bitten. He had sat on a nail, which protruded from a small wooden trapdoor. He had inadvertently discovered the Viet Cong's secret tunnels. Being a wiry 130-pound soldier, he dropped into the tunnel and reported spotting 30 Viet Cong hiding just feet below the troops searching the jungle above. When efforts made with smoke and tear gas to evacuate the hiding rebels failed, the Allied forces resorted to explosives. They soon realized that throwing explosive charges into the tunnel entrances would be largely ineffective. These tunnels were an incredible feat of primitive engineering. During roughly 21 years of digging, using only small shovels, tin bowls, and wooden baskets, many villages within South Vietnam had developed their own network of tunnels, the location of which was known only to the inhabitants of each respective village as a security measure in case one of them was captured and interrogated. Every house might have its own trapdoor entrance, hidden underneath a large cooking pot or outside the home in a pig pen, unlikely to be discovered under a pile of manure. Over the years, these tunnel systems crisscrossed the country, from Saigon to more than 400 miles north beyond the DMZ. New tunnels dug by the Viet Cong connected the existing village networks, allowing them to move several kilometers without ever surfacing. Tunnels dug right into the French-controlled city of Saigon allowed communist spies and saboteurs to enter and leave the city unnoticed. Where the soil permitted, tunnels extended to depths beyond 30 feet below the surface, with some systems having as many as 4 separate levels. Along with strategic emplacements at tree lines, other entrances were hidden in the high grass, under dense ground cover and bushes, or even, like that of a beaver's dam, underwater along riverbanks. The trapdoors were often padded with rubber or mud, creating a ground-like feel underfoot when stepped on. During construction, dirt brought to the surface was concealed in order to avoid detection. Dumped into American bomb craters, the river, or otherwise spread evenly along the ground, it was carried up at night with plastic bags and taken as far from the tunnel openings as possible. The tunnels opened into subterranean rooms, ranging in size, with a larger cavity, for instance, measuring approximately 6 feet high by 15 feet wide. These many rooms served as a variety of sleeping quarters, supply caches, armories, kitchens, briefing rooms, movie theaters, and even rudimentary hospitals. Although often insufficient for proper circulation, small air vents were channeled to the surface. The openings hidden beneath bushes at the base of trees were disguised as ant and termite nests. Pepper or other masking smells were used in these vents to confuse the tracker dogs, which Americans used during their search and destroy patrols. The smells of cooking and burning wood were channeled through multiple smaller vents in order to better disperse the odor at the surface. Increased artillery bombardment and foot patrols by Allied forces forced the Viet Cong and villagers to remain underground. Life for those living prolonged periods in the tunnels was hardly enviable, as they often faced starvation, suffocation, and crushing death from collapsing tunnels. Some women were forced to give birth in the tunnels, while massive explosions ravaged the earth above them. While doctors were present in some of the makeshift hospitals, limited access to medical supplies meant that rudimentary methods were used. For instance, if a blood transfusion was required, some doctors report rigging a bicycle pump together with rubber hosing and glass bottles to conduct the procedure. damaged bones would have to be cut using pliers. When they were not fighting, building traps or improvised explosives, or bleeding out on an operating table, tunnel occupants were limiting their movement, lying face down on the tunnel floors to conserve oxygen. In spite of the miserable circumstances, the Vietnamese, like their enemies, would look for ways to remain creative and keep their minds active, distracted from the reality of their situation. As the GIs would write letters to their families in the daylight above, so too would the VC fighters write by candlelight, their last wills, letters to their loved ones, memoirs, and stories. They too often wondered if they would live to see their work published. As with the tunnel discovered by Sergeant Green, many of them were intentionally engineered to be disorienting, with many bends and twists. This design also helped diminish the destructive effect of explosives, especially those charges and grenades that Allied troops would attempt to toss in without actually entering the tunnels. Additionally, the Viet Cong viewed straight tunnels as impractical. Adding blind corners provided concealment of booby traps and for escaping fighters, giving them time to disappear into many concealed trapdoors in the floors or ceilings or other niches, where they could then wait to ambush a pursuing enemy. Allied forces soon realized that entering the tunnels would be required to effectively destroy them, as well as to kill or capture the enemy and obtain potential intelligence within. Since the Vietnamese were of smaller stature than the Allied men, the tunnels were exceedingly cramped and difficult to move through. Their initial attempts at using trained dogs to clear the tunnels failed, as many of them were killed by the numerous booby traps. American, Australian, and New Zealand commands began recruiting and training volunteers from their ranks who were small enough to enter the tunnels, combat engineers and infantrymen, typically shorter than 5.5 feet. Appropriately named the Tunnel Rats, even the Viet Cong begrudgingly acknowledged their bravery for entering the tunnels, as fighting inside them was a terrifying experience for both sides. In addition to the mental fatigue was the physical exhaustion. So extensive were the tunnel systems, after hours spent underground clearing them, disoriented soldiers may find themselves surfacing miles away from the point at which they entered. Even exiting the tunnel was concerning. Not knowing where they might come up, they could be mistaken as an enemy fighter and shot by friendly forces. While newly issued M16 rifles were already notorious for jamming after firing only 3 or 4 rounds, they were also twice the length of the tunnel's narrow width, making them difficult to maneuver. Tunnel rats resorted to carrying only their .45 caliber pistols and bayonets. Unfortunately, those who fired the .45 in the tunnels were often left with ruptured eardrums or disorienting hearing damage. The men began using issued or improvised silencers, or small caliber pistols sent from back home, to reduce both the blinding muzzle flash and the deafening sound created in the confined space. Entering into a tunnel often required a strong stomach, as well as ignoring any sense of fear or foreboding. After skirmishes, Viet Cong were known to drag their dead inside the tunnels, sometimes burying them into the very walls, in order to deceptively hide their death counts from the Allied forces. The moisture in the dank tunnels quickly rotted the corpses, the stench drifting heavily into the upper levels and entryways. Although disturbing, encountering actual rats inside the tunnels, some the size of small dogs, was sometimes considered a welcome sight. Viet Cong fighters were known to eat the rats. Their presence was an indication that the tunnel might be empty. If it wasn't, a tunnel rat could abruptly encounter an enemy fighter hiding in a small alcove, or suddenly speared in the body or throat from a concealed hatch or false wall, or even from behind as he reached a dead end, having passed an enemy hiding behind a concealed entrance. Many tunnels were designed with concealed booby traps at their entrances and along the tunnels. If not simply a Viet Cong fighter waiting to shoot the first soldier who tried to Some tunnel rats, entering headfirst into the narrow opening, experienced sudden terror as the tunnel floor gave way under their weight, and they plummeted into a concealed punchy stick trap. Grenades and other traps were embedded in the walls with tripwires. Many of the non-lethal traps, boxes loaded with painful insects like scorpions, hornets, centipedes, and ants, were meant to scare rather than to kill. To many fighters, the psychological fear of injury was often more chilling than the thought of death. Poisonous vipers were starved and tied to the tunnel ceilings. Passing by, unnoticed by the crawling soldier, the snake would bite their unsuspecting victim, often in the face or neck. He might make it back out of the tunnel, but would eventually succumb to the painful neurotoxins. Tunnel rats could find their throats being slashed or garroted, strangled with wire, as they pushed their heads through small trapdoors leading into lower tunnels and chambers. Other sections of tunnel, dug vertically, allowed waiting enemy fighters to drop grenades down onto approaching tunnel rats. U-bend portions, flooded with water, were designed to protect the Viet Cong from tear gas or other attempts to flush the tunnels with smoke. Passing through these gooseneck portions of tunnel required a tunnel rat to hold his breath for an unknown amount of time, with the thought of reaching the other end to possibly find it blocked, or otherwise being suddenly impaled by a waiting enemy spear. Sometimes, without warning, the tunnels themselves would simply collapse, crushing or pinning the now helpless soldier. Standard operating procedures evolved throughout the war. At least 2 soldiers would enter the tunnel, one crawling a few meters behind the other, to prevent both from dying as the result of an explosive booby trap. The other would then laboriously pull his friend's body back to the surface. When they did fire their weapons, they tried to never fire more than 3 consecutive rounds before reloading, preventing the enemy from determining how many shots they had left. Studies conducted during the war indicated that these men gradually developed a superior sense of hearing and smell. They avoided overwashing, the use of fragrant soaps, or anything else that might result in a distinguishable odor. Although they carried flashlights, tunnel rats in training were advised to adopt a standard operating procedure: do not turn on the light. Rather, experienced rats would become adept at using their other senses, hearing, smell, and touch, to move through the tunnel, constantly feeling for booby traps and sensing the presence of enemy fighters. Telling the story of his first enemy encounter in the tunnels, a Marine tunnel rat recounted that he was challenged by his friends to get his first kill without firing his weapon. Experiencing a dreadful sense of unease, he entered into his first tunnel. After some time, crawling through the narrow and pitch-black passage, he suddenly paused. He could smell another man's breath. The concealed man then lunged in the darkness. As they fiercely grappled in the narrow space, the fighting ended when the young Marine managed to seize his unseen enemy's throat and crush his windpipe. As thrilling as this and other such encounters are for us to hear, it goes without saying, such stories have only been recounted by those who made it out of the tunnels alive. Tunnel rats suffered a casualty rate of 1 out of every 3 who entered the tunnels, with many who didn't die being permanently maimed and injured, if not physically, psychologically. Both Vietnamese and American fighters expressed shared sentiments towards the violence and brushes with death that became a routine experience. If I die, I die. If I make it, I make it. The more of your friends died, the more you wanted sea. An awful end to a catastrophic war. The harrowing experiences of the men and women fighting in the sweltering jungles and rice paddies of Vietnam and those suffocating tunnels and cavernous spaces under them is incredible, if not disturbingly tragic. It is unquestionably a simultaneous example of the extent of human courage and sacrifice. Many of the children born in the tunnels, as well as the men and women fighting a war in and above them, still walk among us. Perhaps wearing scars, not visible on their bodies. Like them, we may find ourselves left with a sense of mingled pride and remorse, along with many unanswered questions. We must remember, the only ones who can tell us these stories are the ones who survived. For those who fought and died, we respect and honor their memory and the sacrifice paid by both them and their families. For those still living, we offer nothing less than our utmost respect. Early 1940s, tens of thousands of innocent children and concentration camp prisoners were involuntarily subjected to horrific medical experiments, all of which were carried out with the fanatical compliance of German physicians, nurses, and scientists, as well as subjugated Jewish doctors imprisoned in the camps. Founded entirely on Hitler's pseudoscientific beliefs and utter mythology, these inhuman experiments centered on the creation of a stronger German people, a return to the true Aryan race, superior above all others. While we may use their professional title as a descriptive term, these were not doctors. They were monsters. This is part one of the story of the depraved doctors of the Third Reich. Following the end of World War I, Germany suffered severe economic hardship, with insurmountable reparations charged to the nation by the Treaty of Versailles. The German currency became worthless. The German people were starving. For the nations that had lost the war, the dreadful carnage on the battlefield seemed to be a sacrifice paid for nothing in return. For many, the only explanation for German defeat was conspiracy. With interracial and religious conflict dating back far beyond the 20th century, German radicals and defeated German military leadership, the latter seeking to avoid personal consequences from their policies, propagated a stab-in-the-back myth. Through propaganda, they attributed the loss of the war not to the battlefield, but to internal betrayal by traitors working for foreign interests, primarily Jews and communists. Despite being entirely untrue, German radicals now seized on the opportunity to exploit a war-torn nation characterized by resentment and despair. Propaganda insinuated that Jews had conspired to not only instigate the war, to bring about financial and economic ruin, but then to capitalize on it. While Germany began a long and difficult recovery, a rise of diverse political factions and radical ideas about how to rebuild a stronger German nation emerged. One of these groups was Adolf Hitler and his Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, or the National Socialist Workers' Party, known more commonly by its abbreviated form, the Nazis. Hitler was seen as a strong leader who was restoring order to the country. By 1933, he and his Nazi party had taken control of Germany. The Nazis soon controlled the majority of German media, newspapers, magazines, books, even children's books and toys, public meetings, rallies, art, music, movies, and radio. Viewpoints in any way threatening to Nazi beliefs or to the regime were censored or eliminated from all media. Hitler began incorporating much of the anti-Jewish rhetoric into the official history of the nation. Indeed, Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, was transmuted into the political horizon of the Third Reich. It was the Nazis' biblical text. In his writing, Hitler elaborated on many of his unfounded scientific and racial beliefs. He divided humans into categories based on physical appearance, establishing higher and lower orders, or types of humans. At the top, according to Hitler, is something he refers to as the Aryan, a healthy Germanic man with fair skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and no genetic defects. Despite lacking any proof of his claims, Hitler believed that the German people were direct descendants of the Aryan race, which was effectively the people of the lost city of Atlantis. And so it follows in Hitler's thinking, if there is a supreme form of human, then there must be others less than supreme, the Untermenschen, or racially inferior. Hitler assigned this position to Jews and the Slavic peoples, notably the Czechs, Poles, and Russians. He believed that the German race, the true Aryans, had been taken in, manipulated by these inferior races of people over the centuries, eventually interbreeding and thus sullying the Aryan bloodline. Hitler sought to reverse this anthropological blunder, a supposed perversion of the natural order. This philosophy by no means believes in an equality of races, he writes, but along with their difference, it recognizes their higher or lesser value and feels itself obligated to promote the victory of the better and stronger and demand the subordination of the inferior and weaker in accordance with the eternal will that dominates this universe. Hitler goes on to say that subjugated peoples actually benefit by being conquered because they come in contact with and learn from the superior Aryans. However, he adds they benefit only as long as the Aryan remains the absolute master and doesn't mingle or intermarry with inferior conquered peoples. But it is the Jews, specifically, Hitler writes, who are engaged in a conspiracy to keep this master race from assuming its rightful position as rulers of the world, by tainting its racial and cultural purity, and even inventing forms of government in which the Aryan comes to believe in equality and fails to recognize his racial superiority. These manipulated views of the country's history, this conspiracy idea, and the notion of competition for world domination between Jews and Aryans would become widespread beliefs in Nazi Germany and would even be taught to school children to indoctrinate them. This, combined with Hitler's racial attitude toward the Jews, would be shared to varying degrees by millions of Germans and people from occupied countries, so that they either remained silent or actively participated in the Nazi effort to exterminate their own Jewish neighbors, and ultimately the entire Jewish population of Europe. Thus began a period of overt racial division within the country, endorsed openly by the National Socialist government. Placing Dr. Joseph Goebbels at the head of the Nazi propaganda ministry, Hitler utilized a combination of media propaganda and political rhetoric of we versus them to firmly convince the Germans that specific races of people were responsible for the country's problems, particularly the economic woes, Writer Ben Irvine summarizes, "In Germany, as elsewhere, Hitler insisted these Jewish capitalist hyenas aimed at nothing less than the financial domination of the entire economy. Jewish finance," Hitler warns, "demands not only the absolute economic destruction of Germany, but its complete political enslavement." Beginning in 1933, over the next 5 to 6 years, this divisive rhetoric was institutionalized. It was incorporated into the governing philosophy of applied biology, mandating its teaching in public schools and universities. Nazi student organizations, professors, and librarians were quick to tally up long lists of books they thought should not be read by Germans, inciting a raid of libraries and bookstores across the country. The books were eventually ceremonially burned on May 10, 1933. The message was clear. Anything opposing Nazi ideology would be destroyed. Hitler's racist ideas, Aryan myths, and pseudoscience were to be converted into concrete measures, obsessively applied at every level of the state. This was a new Germany, soon to be characterized by racial hygiene laws, persecution, and concentration camps for detaining German enemies and traitors. In pursuit of a stronger German people, even non-Jewish German citizens who failed to live up to the Aryan standard were to be eliminated. As history often demonstrates, the road to hell being paved with good intentions, it would appear that well-meaning intellectuals, professors, scientists, and most particularly the medical profession, played a decisive role in Nazi policies and the implementation of the Holocaust. With the nearly 4,000 Jewish doctors eventually stripped of their ability to practice medicine in Nazi Germany, many among the remaining non-Jewish physicians supported the regime and went on to violate their Hippocratic oaths, performing grotesque experiments and demonstrating incomprehensible levels of brutality in the government-sponsored murder of millions of innocent people. But why? Considering there was no apparent retribution for not joining the Nazi Party, historians argue that these men and women were captivated with the idea of advancing their own professions, as well as the Nazis' intellectual ideologies for improving the human race through science. Effectively, physicians and nurses became agents of the state, no longer caring for their patients. Their oath of loyalty was sworn towards their Führer and the health of the nation. So committed to their belief in Hitler's racial pseudoscience and ludicrous anthropological beliefs in Aryan descendants, the Nazis were soon to begin murdering even their own citizens for the sake of a stronger German people. Despite its negative connotations specific to Nazi Germany, the idea of eugenics has long been a popular idea among advancing human civilization. This theory holds that through selective breeding, whether animals or humans, lies the ability to create a stronger species with desirable hereditary traits. At the time Hitler began implementing his own brand of eugenics in Nazi Germany, the study and beliefs in eugenics theory were popular in other leading world nations, in England, the United States, Japan, and Scandinavia, among others. In fact, much of Germany's foundational research into eugenics began in the U.S., a country which had begun developing eugenics research and health studies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For instance, in the state of Virginia in 1933, sterilization of people was legal under state laws. Mid-1930s U.S. medical journals can even be recounted as containing articles which express a competitive interest in catching up to the Nazis' more progressive eugenics policies during the 1930s. Ironically, during the 1920s and 30s, Germany's medical community was considered the best in the world, the height of scientific and medical advancement. Even by U.S. standards, an accomplished doctor was considered one who had studied in Germany. This arrogance may have prompted a general feeling of superiority, not only within the German medical community, but subsequently throughout the nation. But still, how were thousands of German doctors and nurses led to corrupt their practice and commit millions of murders? With incremental steps, which, with proper framing, appeared tolerable and even benevolent. Hitler despised anyone he considered unfit to live, including those individuals deemed incurably ill, physically or mentally disabled, emotionally distraught, and elderly. Many of them being unfit to work or provide for themselves. Nazi rhetoric categorized these individuals as burdensome lives. Beginning in 1933, in the interest of preserving hereditary health, the German government promulgated a new law for the forced sterilization of such individuals suffering from a range of disabilities and ailments. Vasectomy was the usual sterilization method for men, and for women, tubal ligation, an invasive procedure that resulted in the deaths of hundreds of women. Following his invasion of Poland, in September of 1939, Hitler sought to take advantage of the cloak of war to further eliminate these unwanted individuals, these useless feeders from German society. The Nazi T4 program, also called the T4 euthanasia program, signaled a period of the accepted practice of not only routine sterilization, but the killing of German children and adults. Physicians active in the study of eugenics, who saw Nazism as applied biology, enthusiastically endorsed this program. School children were even performing mathematical exercises in school to teach them the burdensome costs of keeping and caring for adults and children with disabilities. Now entering into what would become the Second World War, the Nazi government argued they needed to free up all available resources, personnel, and beds in the medical institutions for the disabled to treat the wounded soldiers returning from the front lines. Ironically, so sadistic was the Nazi regime, they inevitably killed many of their own wounded soldiers for the sake of their eugenic policies against the disabled. Doctors and nurses were given free rein in many aspects, as they were encouraged to evaluate and indiscriminately kill any patient they deemed to be suffering, thus justifying murder with the idea of providing their patients a quick death over a life of doubtless suffering. They embraced the Nazi philosophy of healing through killing. Many of the victims of the T4 program were killed by their own caretakers, either with injections or by luring them into the newly constructed hospital rooms resembling showers, only to be asphyxiated to death with carbon monoxide. As with much of the Nazi propaganda, the term euthanasia was given a more compassionate and acceptable definition, being propagated by German government and the media as a mercy killing for sufferers of incurable ailments and disorders. Falling victim to these lies, blinded by their oath of national loyalty, unwitting German families were manipulated into believing that giving birth to a malformed baby was harmful to the health of the German nation. Midwives and nurses were mandated by German law to report any infant born with a birth defect. The midwives were offered further encouragement by being paid for each child they reported. German parents began relinquishing their afflicted children, young and old, to the nurses and doctors who offered false reassurances, promising them they would get the best care in a government institution. Nurses then put infants in their care out on the hospital veranda to slowly die of hypothermia in the freezing weather. They withheld feeding to starve infants to death, or otherwise fed older children overdoses of sedative medications or sent them to the showers. In court proceedings after the war, nurses were said to speak of how lovingly we held the children while we encouraged them to drink the medication which would kill them. We didn't want them to suffer more than necessary. Each hospital had a department which would write condolence letters to the family, falsely citing natural causes of death for the loss of their family member. Despite moderate attempts to conceal the murders from the communities nearby, the deaths of family members, as well as the billowing smoke from the crematoriums, could not be overlooked. Local communities began recognizing the gray-windowed buses passing by for what they were: transports filled with the disabled, transferring them to the nearby hospitals for their imminent murder. From 1939 until the end of the war in 1945, roughly 400,000 German citizens were sterilized against their will. Nazi doctors and nurses further euthanized 200,000 disabled German children and adults. The simultaneous construction of crematoriums and gas chambers in Germany foreshadowed the unspeakable number of murders which were to occur before the end of the war. And what makes genocide an easier task? The systematic dehumanization of the entire group to be eliminated. The widespread German acceptance of the Aryan myth and the ongoing normalization of anti-Semitism was part of a larger plan. Nazis wanted the complete eradication of Jewish people from the country, and then Europe. From 1933 to 1938, the Nazi Party and its supporters implemented a systematic level of restrictions designed to impoverish Jews and prevent them from participating in the German economy by requiring them to register their property and preventing them from earning a living. In late 1935, laws were passed to revoke Jewish citizenship and to prevent Jews from marrying or having sexual relations with persons of German or related blood. Germans themselves were encouraged to marry only those with desirable hereditary traits and were even required to obtain a certificate of fitness from public health authorities before they could marry. Even those German citizens who did not fully accept the Nazi propaganda about their Jewish neighbors still avoided them for fear of being reported for illegal fraternization. During this period of increasing anti-Semitism, characterized by flagrant murders, abuse, plundering, and burning of Jewish synagogues and properties, many Jews decided to leave Germany as quickly as possible. While many did attempt to emigrate, a significant number were either unsuccessful or stayed in Germany with the hope of keeping their family together, or of finding a way to live, even under the brutal circumstances. In accordance with Nazi propaganda, a message of German overpopulation and the need for a superior race to have room to grow justified German expansion into neighboring territories. With these geographic expansions, as many Jews as had escaped Germany were now being increasingly repopulated by those Jews residing in the now Nazi-occupied territories. Despite his overt racial beliefs, Hitler understood the political implications of outright murder. After all, Jewish people had served in the German military during World War I. They had lived side by side with the non-Jewish population. It could not be overlooked if hundreds of thousands of people were simply being rounded up and disappearing. Unsettling rumors of Nazi exterminations of Jews were already beginning to cause unrest throughout the German citizenry. This was, after all, one of the elite nations of the world. Thus, a preliminary policy measure of out of sight, out of mind was employed. The Jewish people remaining in Germany and its occupied regions were forced from their homes, separated from the rest of the population, so that they may be forgotten by their German neighbors, now consolidated far away into filthy and overcrowded ghettos. While Nazi leadership deliberated on this Jewish problem, the Jewish people were now subjected to living conditions which were nothing less than miserable. Beginning in 1941, Hitler's final solution began its implementation as the Jewish ghettos were systematically emptied and destroyed, their occupants either being shot and buried in mass graves nearby, or deported by train to forced labor in concentration camps. Now presented with an unequal opportunity for genetic research and the advancement of the German master race through the study of eugenics, Nazi doctors were given positions of authority in many of these camps. Again, they were given the power to choose who among their charges would live and who would die. Doctors were made responsible for the supervision of the selections, gassings, and the killings. Corrupted by their blind loyalty and subjective fascinations with new science, they did not hesitate to use prisoners held in several concentration camps as guinea pigs. Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Schaffenspreik, Neuengang, Mauthausen, Natzweiler, Stutthof. At the summit of this policy of dehumanization, Auschwitz. They had been accused of conspiring to instigate the First World War, systematically discriminated and abused by their neighbors and government for years, separated from the population, crowded into filthy ghettos. And now they were uniformly rounded up and either shot into mass graves or deported by train to the tens of thousands of Nazi concentration camps to be exterminated like animals. This was the plight of the Jews, Gypsies, Slavic peoples, and all of whom Hitler viewed as racially inferior. With millions of human lives now at their disposal in these camps, German doctors, scientists, and pharmaceutical manufacturers decided not to waste an unprecedented opportunity for the advancement of their medical research and Hitler's baseless beliefs in racial science. This is part 2 of the story of the depraved doctors of the Third Reich. They disembarked the train, dehydrated to the point of hallucination, starved and weary from having to stand for days in an overcrowded cattle car, in the unbreathable stench of their own urine and excrement, and the smell of those who died on the journey. Signs along the tracks leading into the camp told the new arrivals the name of their destination: Konzentrationslager Auschwitz, known informally by the Germans as the KZ. Had they arrived among the first convoys, their journey might have ended in a mass grave. The Nazis had encountered a problem, however: the stench of tens of thousands of rotting corpses. Thus, the solution of burning the corpses was implemented, and the crematoriums were constructed. Now, the air that surrounded the deportees reeked of a new odor: burning flesh. Hopefuls among the new group remarked to each other that the smell might be a meal of cooked chicken waiting for them. Their first encounter was often with the camp's chief physician. For those arriving to Auschwitz after May of 1943, it was the young Schutzstaffel Obersturmführer, or senior storm leader, Dr. Josef Mengele. With a casual flick of the wrist, he and other such uniformed doctors sentenced the new arrivals to one of two fates. To the right side, able-bodied men and women, those who would be condemned to die a slower death through forced labor and starvation, and those who appeared interesting enough to serve as human guinea pigs. To the left side, women, children, the elderly, the crippled and infirm, those who were given false reassurances of a shower, a warm meal, living quarters, and reunification with their loved ones. Panicked at the thought of being separated from their parents, young women sent to the right side would plead to go with their aging parents and grandparents into the left column, expressing tearful gratitude when the Nazis would permit them to stay with their family. Some survivors recount their lifelong grief from this moment, such as that of an older sister who encouraged her younger brother to go with the left column, to stay with their mother. She would never see either of them again. Parents who were selected for the right-hand column often protested being separated from their children. Many fathers and mothers would cling to their young children in desperation as the Nazi guards and capos forcibly separated them, shouting reassurances that they would be reunited. Even under a barrage of painful blows to the face and head from the capos' rubber clubs, terrified parents still did not relent their grip on their children. Eyewitness accounts from survivors state their abject horror as they watched small children having their limbs torn from their bodies in the struggle. The left column was then marched a short distance away, 300 yards across the camp, into the courtyard of a red brick building. Then, under a reassuring sign reading baths and disinfecting room, down a flight of concrete steps into a large room full of numbered hooks and benches. A prisoner in the camp, Dr. Miklos Niesli, recalls sadly that many among the group he witnessed went down the steps almost gaily. Here they were made to undress. The stubbornly modest women and young girls who refused were forcibly stripped. They were instructed to fold their clothes and keep their shoes organized so they could find them later. This, of course, was a lie. These final instructions were only to lessen the work of the Sonderkommando, as the clothes and any remaining valuables would be collected and sold to fund the Nazi war effort, or otherwise delivered to German cities in need of supplies. The Nazis simply didn't want the shoe sizes getting mixed up. The arrivals were then herded into a long room with wired metal columns spaced along the center. The doors were then locked, the lights switched off. A medical van would shortly arrive on the road above, perversely bearing the insignia of the International Red Cross. Uniformed men would exit the vehicle wearing masks and carrying canisters, moving to the small concrete pipes jutting above the ground over the shower room. They swiftly emptied a granular substance into the opening before shutting it and waiting for the screaming to stop. The first to perish would be the children and weaker adults, as they were trampled and crushed to death by their families and friends around them in their frantic effort to survive, to escape the rising cloud of suffocating gas. as he was present to witness one of these many occurrences. Dr. Neasley writes,
"In order to be certain of their business, the two guest butchers waited another 5 minutes. Then they lighted cigarettes and drove off in their car. They had just killed 3,000 innocents."
The right-hand column, meanwhile, had not moved. Dr. Neasley recounts his experience, writing,
"Dr. Mengele ordered all the doctors to step forward. He then approached the new group, composed of some 50 doctors, and asked those who had studied in a German university, who had a thorough knowledge of pathology and had practiced forensic medicine, to step forward. Be very careful," Mengele added. "You must be equal to the task, for if you are not," and his menacing gesture left little to the imagination.
Dr. Neasley was an accomplished forensic and anatomical pathologist. He stepped forward. After being questioned by Mengele, he was then assigned to the KZ Sonderkommando. The story of the Sonderkommando alone is deserving of its own telling. For the sake of this story, it should at least be understood that they, like the Kapos, were prisoners of the camp. The Kapos, the Kameradschaftspolizei, the camaraderie police, were often convicted and violent criminals, chosen for their willingness for brutality. Offered significantly better living conditions and food, they were given auxiliary leadership positions over their fellow inmates. Faithfully serving the SS, even as prisoners themselves, they were charged with the discipline and even killing of misbehaved prisoners. Similar to these men, in exchange for keeping their lives and the provision of better conditions, the Sonderkommando did much of the dirty work in the crematoriums and medical labs, while the Nazi SS merely gave the orders. Auschwitz survivor and author Primo Levi writes of the Nazis' philosophy regarding this use of prisoners.
"It is not enough to relegate them to marginal tasks. The best way to bind them is to burden them with a guilt, cover them with blood, compromise them as much as possible. They will thus have established with their instigators the bond of complicity, and they will no longer be able to turn it back."
In routine fashion, every 4 months, the Sonderkommando would be summarily liquidated. They were executed to prevent any single prisoner from witnessing more than the Nazis felt was allowable. A new group from an arriving train would be selected to replace them and to burn and dispose of the bodies of their predecessors. As a witness, Dr. Neasley was one of the few prisoners to have escaped death after passing through the gates of the crematoria. By the date of Dr. Neasley's arrival, Auschwitz was comprised of multiple adjacent or nearby camps. With increasing numbers of deportees arriving by train, a 3-pronged railroad track and additional crematoriums had been constructed at Auschwitz II. Also referred to as Birkenau, these added features were constructed in order to speed up the selection and gassing of deportees upon their arrival. With Birkenau serving as the primary extermination camp at Auschwitz, it likewise served as the experimental camp, with the nearby crematoria serving to dispose of the victims' bodies. Relatively few people ever had the opportunity to speak of the atrocities witnessed at these camps, for the vast majority were slaughtered almost immediately upon their arrival. It therefore goes without saying that these truly horrific stories have been primarily told by the only people who can.
the survivors. The purpose for human experimentation varied among the different concentration camps around Germany and the Nazi-occupied regions. In part, German pharmaceutical companies took advantage of the unfettered access to living humans on which to test a variety of new vaccines and medications. Many more experiments were military-related, aimed at improving scientific knowledge of how to treat and prevent German soldiers' injuries, infections, illnesses, and subsequent deaths on the battlefield. Still further were those experiments conducted under the Nazi premise of proving the viability of their theories on race, their pseudoscientific belief in Aryan racial superiority. In pursuit of these ideologies, the approximately 200 offending Nazi physicians enjoyed complete freedom to act without regard to basic medical ethics and without any consideration for the health of their patients, their victims. Indeed, nearly all subjects endured incredible suffering, mutilation, and indescribable pain. The experiments were often deliberately designed to terminate in a fatal outcome for their victims. Founded in 1925, Interessengemeinschaft Farbenindustrie AG, or IG Farben, became a conglomerate of companies that would monopolize the country's chemical production and come to own all of Germany's major pharmaceutical industries. In a perverse coupling of scientific research and government-sponsored extermination, Nazi physicians received financial backing from and maintained close professional and research contacts with such leading medical institutions and universities, as well as an ongoing relationship with research laboratories. A strong supporter of the Third Reich, during the war, IG Farben sponsored numerous operations associated with the criminal activities of the Nazi regime, including the use of slave labor in factories built close to the concentration camps, such as that at Auschwitz. IG Farben played a decisive role in the German army's chemical warfare program, as well as contributing to the Nazi effort in exterminating unwanted peoples. IG Farben manufactured the cyanide pesticides, the cans of Zyklon B gas, that were used in the gas chambers. With regard to medical and pharmacological research projects, IG Farben was heavily involved in experimental programs using patients both from the Nazi regime's T4 euthanasia programs and those recruited without their consent from concentration camps. These projects included paying SS physician Helmut Wetter to test their newly developed drugs on deliberately infected patients at Auschwitz, as well as at the Buchenwald, Dachau, and Mauthausen camps. The subsidiary company Bayer was particularly active in Auschwitz. A senior Bayer official oversaw the chemical factory in Auschwitz III, or Monowitz. Most of the experiments were conducted in Birkenau, in Block 20. The Women's Camp Hospital, with Drs. Wetter, Edward Wirtz, and Friedrich Contress, testing newly developed drugs on deliberately infected prisoners. Taken from Auschwitz, hundreds of women were sold to the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company for additional unknown drug experiments, from which all known test subjects were noted in correspondence letters as having died during testing. The letters were sent to request more test subjects. Hitler's regime sponsored an additional series of inhuman experiments for alleged ideological, military, and medical purposes. They were undertaken under Heinrich Himmler's direct orders to gain knowledge of certain wartime conditions
faced by the German Wehrmacht, or armed forces. The Nazi doctors considered military necessity adequate justification for their heinous experiments, saying that the prisoners were condemned to death anyway. There were several forms of war injury-related experiments. At the German concentration camps of Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Natzweiler, Buchenwald, and Neuengamme, scientists used camp inmates to test immunization compounds and antibodies for the prevention and treatment of contagious diseases. Nazi SS Dr. Kurt Heissmeyer eagerly sought to have his name on research which disproved the popular belief that tuberculosis was an infectious disease, and to develop a vaccination serum against TB. In November of 1944, with assistance from the camp's chief medical officer, Dr. Alfred Trebinski, 10 girls and 10 boys, aged between 5 and 12 years old, were brought from Auschwitz to Neuengamme. Heissmeyer's experiments were conducted on hundreds of adults and the 20 Jewish children. Dr. Heissmeyer lacerated the children's skin and rubbed tuberculosis bacilli into the wounds, or otherwise injected live bacterium into his victims' lungs to attempt to immunize them against TB. He also painfully excised the lymph glands from the arms of the Jewish children. About 200 adult subjects died from these experiments. The fate of the 20 surviving children, however, did not end in the camp. In mid-April of 1945, with Allied forces drawing closer, Heissmeyer and SS Obersturmführer Arnold Strippel deliberated on their best course of action, realizing the war was lost. On April 20th, the children, their 4 adult caretakers, and 6 Soviet prisoners were transported to the nearby Bullenhauser school in Hamburg, which had been used as a satellite camp since October of the previous year. The children were told that they had to be vaccinated against typhoid fever before continuing the journey to another camp. Arriving at the school, the children were unloaded and were immediately taken to the basement and ordered to undress. One of the attending SS officers reportedly stated, "They sat down on the benches all around and were cheerful and happy that they had been for once allowed out of Neuengamme. The children were completely unsuspecting." Rather than receiving vaccinations, the children were then injected with morphine by Dr. Trebinski. Using lengths of rope, they were then hanged by the neck from hooks on the walls of the basement. The adults were similarly hanged from pipes in the ceiling. The Nazi SS men found it difficult, however, to kill the mutilated children. The first child to be strung up was so light, due to disease and malnutrition, that the rope would not strangle him. SS Untersturmführer Johann Frahm later shamelessly recounted that he proceeded to bear hug the child and had to use all of his own body weight to tighten the noose. Then he hanged the other children, 2 at a time, from different hooks. "Just like pictures on the wall," he recalled. He added that none of the children had cried. The German armed forces had suffered heavy casualties on the Russian front in 1941 to 1943 because of gas gangrene, a bacterial infection that produces an odorous gas in gangrenous wounds. These casualties and other combat-related infections generated an interest in creating a pharmaceutical treatment to replace surgery and amputation. Overseeing the experiments at Ravensbrück, Professor Karl Gebhardt and his assistants, Drs. Fritz Fischer, Hertha Oberhüser, Rudolf Rosenthal, and Gerhard Schlauski, began by testing newly developed sulfa drugs. Ravensbrück camp contained mostly Polish women, dissenters and troublemakers to the Nazis during their invasion and occupation of Poland. Foregoing the use of anesthesia, wounds were deliberately inflicted on camp prisoners, both men and women. The flesh of their victims' bodies and limbs would be filleted. The open wounds were then infected with bacteria such as streptococcus, gas gangrene, and tetanus, after which only some of the patients were given one of the tested drugs. When serious infections failed to develop in their test subjects' wounds, they resorted to more gruesome measures. Wounds were reopened and filled with dirt, sawdust, rusty nails, slivers of glass, and other matter. The lacerations were then stitched closed to see how infections would develop in the bone and living tissue. SS Chief Medical Officer Professor Ernst Robert Krevitz visited the camp to oversee the experiments, remarking that the experiments still did not fully resemble conditions on the battlefield. He suggested they try shooting the women to inflict more accurate battle wounds. Instead, Professor Gebhardt and Dr. Fischer resorted to clamping their subject's muscle tissue at both ends of the lacerated wound so as to cut off circulation, as was commonly observed in the shattered tissue of bullet injuries. Some of the women were sent to the gas chambers after these torturous sessions. Many died from the experiments. Few still fortunately survived to give their testimony during the trials. In addition to infection, methods were explored to deal with bone fractures and grafting. Prisoners' legs were intentionally broken. Not only were sections of bones removed and attempted to be transplanted, but also muscles and nerves in order to study regeneration of these body parts. Since bone grafting was already a known procedure, much of this was unnecessary torture. In an even more senseless effort to discover the efficacy of transplanting severed limbs and joints, physicians at Ravensbrück amputated legs and shoulders from their inmates, and then attempted to transplant them onto other victims' bodies. While death was a common result of these experiments, all of the victims suffered excruciating pain, mutilation, and permanent disability. In 1939, SS Dr. Sigmund Rasche, an officer in the Luftwaffe's medical service, became involved in testing a plant extract as a cancer treatment. Despite being recommended to the use of rodents, Rasche insisted on using human test subjects. Himmler agreed, and a human cancer testing station was established at Dachau. 2 years later, in early 1941, Rasche suggested to Himmler that high-altitude, low-pressure experiments be carried out on live human beings. His goal was to determine the effects of exposure at high altitude when German pilots abandoned their aircraft with or without oxygen equipment and were subjected to low atmospheric pressures. Accompanied by civilian physicians Siegfried Rüff and Hans Romberg of the German Experimental Institute of Aviation, the experiments were carried out in the spring and summer of 1942 using a portable pressure chamber supplied by the Luftwaffe. 5 to 15 prisoners were locked in the chamber, the interior pressure of which was then lowered to a level corresponding to very high altitudes, up to 68,000 feet, or 20,000 meters. Rasche would have them repeatedly subjected to gradual or sudden changes in the air pressure, both increasing and decreasing. Under low-pressure conditions, the victims became frenzied, tearing out their hair, scratching their faces with their nails, beating their heads against the wall, or screaming until they became unconscious. When the pressure was increased, prisoners were observed to undergo profound disturbances of consciousness. Ultimately, their lungs would rupture, causing them to collapse into fits of agonal breathing, otherwise known as death throes. Those who survived the experiment often suffered from severe shock and mental disorders due to the hemorrhages occurring in their brains. After viewing a report of one of the fatal experiments, even Himmler remarked that if a subject should survive such treatment, he should be pardoned life imprisonment. Dr. Rasche replied to Himmler that the victims were merely Poles and Russians, and that he believed they should be given no such amnesty. Autopsies were carried out on the victims, some of whom were still alive, in order to check for the formation of bubbles in their brain tissue. Tissue samples were subsequently removed from their brains, necks, lungs, sympathetic nervous system, liver, heart muscles, kidneys, and muscles from their limbs. Most of the victims died slowly from their injuries. Adding to his list of unethical medical studies, in 1942, Dr. Rasche conducted freezing experiments. He again wrote to Himmler, who granted his request, and it was not long before he was submerging prisoners in ice baths to measure the duration and intensity of their death throes. These experiments were also conducted at Dachau after the high-altitude experiments had concluded. Their purpose was to determine the best way of rewarming German pilots and sailors who had been stranded in the North Sea and suffered severe hypothermia. Dr. Rasche's victims were forced outside to stand naked in the snow, suffering painful frostbite and blistering cold winds for up to 14 hours at a time. They were alternatively forced into a tank of ice water for 3 hours. In an effort to determine how long it took them to freeze in water, pulse and internal temperature were measured using a series of electrodes. Their violent shivering, however, often disrupted these readings and disguised the irregular heartbeats of those who suffered fatal cardiac arrhythmias. Rewarming of the surviving victims was then attempted by different methods. Some were placed under sun lamps, with many having their skin severely damaged by burns. Others would have hot water forcefully irrigated into their stomach, bladder, and rectum. Many suffered excruciating internal blistering of their intestines. Himmler highly supported these experiments, attending some of them in person and indicating that anyone who opposed Rasche's testing should be considered a traitor who would allow German soldiers to die. In reference to an anecdote about locals who lived along the North Sea, Himmler reportedly said he thought that a fisherwoman could well take her half-frozen husband into her bed and revive him in that manner. And he added that locals believed animal warmth had a different effect than artificial warmth. Following his recommendations, Dr. Rasche requested 4 Romani women to be sent from Ravensburg to Dachau. Warming was then attempted by placing the hypothermic victim between 2 naked women. In a display of his complete apathy for the suffering of his patients, Dr. Rascher evidently requested the transfer of his hypothermia lab from Dachau to Auschwitz, which had larger facilities, and where his victims might cause fewer disturbances. Apparently, Rascher complained that his concentration was frequently interrupted when the hypothermia victims shrieked from pain as their extremities froze solid. One witness later testified that some hypothermia victims were thrown directly into boiling water. Out of the roughly 300 prisoners used for these freezing experiments, about 80 to 90 of them died as a result, the remaining majority dying from other harsh living conditions and mistreatment in the camp. In 1951, a 3-page-long post-war deposition was uncovered, written by Heinz Reimer, reportedly one of the few known survivors of Rascher's hypothermia experiments. In addition to these, Reimer describes a series of viral infections and open wounds he suffered at the hands of the Dachau doctors, including Dr. Klaus Schilling's experiments with malaria.
This inhuman Nazi locked me up every day for 2 hours in a glass cage, and I had to endure thousands of Anopheles mosquitoes on my body. Once I could no longer stand the pain, I made an attempt of resistance against the mosquitoes, while I assumed that this would not be seen. But the doctor, if you want to call this beast like this, saw my attempt of resistance in the mirror. For this, I received 7 days of strict detention. But before I was led away to the detention, I received 25 lashes with a leather bullwhip.
Increasingly eager to generate new medical research and to make a name for himself, in early 1944, Dr. Rascher began experimenting with the effects of polygal, a substance he created from beet and apple pectin, which aided blood clotting. He predicted that the preventative use of polygal tablets would reduce bleeding from both gunshot wounds sustained during combat or wounds during surgery. Subjects were given a polygal tablet and then shot through the neck or chest. Rascher further tested his patented coagulant by observing the rate of blood drops that would ooze from freshly amputated legs and arms of living and conscious prisoners at the Dachau crematorium. They were, of course, provided no anesthesia. Rascher would also shoot his Russian prisoners in the spleen whenever he needed extra blood to test. He published an article on his experience of using polygal, intentionally omitting the nature of the unethical testing on live humans, and even set up a company to manufacture the substance, staffed by prisoners. Dr. Kurt Plotner eventually replaced Dr. Rascher as head physician of human experimentation at Dachau. Plotner also administered the hallucinogen mescaline to Jews and Russian prisoners as part of the Nazi search for a truth serum that could be employed as an aid in interrogations. SS Dr. Wolfram Sievers was the managing director of both the German Institute for Military Scientific Research and the Nazi think tank called Ananeba, which sponsored the experimental research at Dachau. In addition to the experiments involving hypothermia and atmospheric pressure, in the late summer of 1944, Nazi physicians at Dachau conducted experiments involving the forced consumption of seawater and its effects on the human body. The post-war trials would determine that Dr. Sievers visited Dachau in July of 1944 to speak with Kurt Plotner and Dr. Wilhelm Begerbock, who ultimately carried out the seawater experiments, along
with Dr. Hans Eppinger. The victims were some 90 German, Czech, and Polish gypsies. Deprived of food, they were given only brackish yellow seawater for days on end. They became so profoundly dehydrated that they were seen licking the floors after they were mopped, just to get a drop of water. The experiments caused excruciating pain, foaming at the mouth, and in most cases, madness. The Nazis also conducted experiments which involved unspeakable varieties of torture that carried no pretense of ethical scientific inquiry. They included additional wound and poison experiments. Reports of experimentation with weaponized chemicals on concentration camp prisoners began as early as 1939 at Sachsenhausen. At the behest of Nazi scientists, prisoners were exposed to mustard gas and phosgene gas in order to test possible antidotes. Beginning in 1942, SS Dr. August Held, the director of the French Anatomical Institute at the Rijksuniversiteit Strasbourg, or Reich University of Strasbourg, initiated the conduct of human experiments with sulfur mustard at the concentration camp Natzweiler. Survivors and witness testimonies during the Nuremberg trials account that sulfur mustard was applied to the upper arms of several dozen prisoners, resulting in blistering and violently painful wounds that spread to the whole body and caused some inmates to go blind. The ointments then tested on the victims reportedly caused even further pain. Several prisoners would have their blisters and wounds reopened after a few days and then intentionally contaminated by the doctors with a combination of common bacteria to observe the development of infection. These experiments caused tremendous pain as they slowly destroyed the subjects' bodies until their deaths several days later. Dr. Hertz's final reports neglected to mention the circumstances of the experiments being conducted on living humans, nor the suffering of his victims. Like Dr. Hertz, Otto Bickenbach was a professor at the University of Strasbourg and an avid member of the Nazi Party. Since 1939, he had been researching possible treatments for the effects of the poison gas phosgene, which was used in combat during World War I. After reviewing and recorded testing on animals of his antidotes, Dr. Wolfram Sievers suggested that Bickenbach continue his experiments in connection with Hertz's weaponized chemical experiments at Natzweiler. According to surviving inmate Ferdinand Holl, the testing of phosgene gas on prisoners began in June 1943. According to his estimate, approximately 90 to 150 inmates were subjected to phosgene, 50 to 60 of whom suffocated to death in violent agony. Testing of phosgene gas then occurred again in 1944. 12 of the 40 inmates involved in these experiments were forced to take Professor Bickenbach's proposed antidote orally. 20 inmates received injections, and a control group of 8 inmates remained unprotected. Willi Herzberg, one of the survivors, told how Bickenbach himself led the inmates into the gas chamber, where he smashed phosgene vials on the ground. Bickenbach then left the gas chamber, and the doors were locked. After 10 minutes in the chamber, Herzberg overheard a muffled splashing caused by the bursting lungs of his fellow prisoners, who collapsed, foaming from their mouths, noses, and ears. His own breathing became distressed, and he had the feeling as if someone was sticking needles into his lungs. On his chest, he sensed a pressure, as if hundreds of kilos were put upon it, and he already thought that he would not survive this. According to Bickenbach's final report, 14 inmates sustained varying degrees of pulmonary edema, an excessive buildup of fluid in their lungs.
At the initiation of Professor Karl Hasse, further poison experiments were conducted at Neuengamme. In early 1945, selected inmates were forced to drink decontaminated water that had been previously poisoned with nitrogen mustard gas to test the efficacy of the decontamination methods. Having investigated Hasse's findings, SS Oberfuhrer Helmut Poppendick deemed these tests insufficient. He urged Himmler to allow Hasse to conduct further testing, arguing that the ingestion of chemical agents be examined in more detail. Hasse evidently wanted to force 8 concentration camp inmates to ingest 8 different chemical agents in harmful doses, while another 8 inmates would be forced to ingest a lower dose that he considered harmless, in order to determine the threshold for overdosage. In February of 1945, Himmler withdrew his approval in consideration of the current situation. The Allied forces were drawing closer, and yet, this was by all accounts the first time Himmler refused to allow human experiments to be conducted in a concentration camp. At the end of August 1943, 86 Jews were gassed by SS Commander Josef Kramer at Natzweiler Stutthof for the purpose of constructing a collection of skulls and skeletons to be kept at the Institute of Anatomy of the Reich University of Strasbourg, under the directorship of Dr. August Hirt and with the direct assistance of Dr. Wolfram Sievers. Dr. Hirt reportedly wished to acquire a large collection of Jewish skulls and skeletons to form a museum dedicated to the soon-to-be extinct Jewish race. Reports indicate that over 100 Jewish prisoners were initially selected at Auschwitz, chosen for their perceived stereotypical racial characteristics. Only 87, 29 women, and 58 men survived to finish the journey by train and forced march to Strasbourg. One of the men was apparently shot for refusing to enter the gas chamber. Kramer reportedly claimed to have pushed the rest into the chamber himself. Following their murder, some of the corpses were used as cadavers for students to dissect, while others were dismembered and placed in storage vats of alcohol. Ultimately, the anthropological project envisioned by Hirt failed to be completed due to a lack of resources. In the meantime, new specimens were still being collected. Mere months before Allied troops reached Auschwitz, in August of 1944, a new convoy of deportees was arriving. Dr. Mengele was again waiting on the platform to peruse the new arrivals. He spotted 2 individuals of interest to him. A hunchbacked father, standing next to his rather tall and handsome son, about 15 or 16 years old. The son exhibited a deformed right foot. Dr. Neasley writes, Mengele sollte have discovered in the person of the hunchbacked father and his lame son a sovereign example to demonstrate his theory of the Jewish race's degeneracy. The father and son were immediately sent to Dr. Neasley's quarters at the No. 1 crematorium. A note with Dr. Mengele's instructions was delivered to Dr. Neasley by their soldier escort, SS Oberscharführer Mossfeld. Mengele wanted the father and his young son thoroughly examined and measured. They were then to be killed and examined again. Overcome with the horrific irony of the situation, Dr. Neasley writes, I, a Jewish doctor, had to examine them and then perform the dissection on the
facing it all, that I suddenly felt myself spinning close to the edge of madness.
He expressed that only through the force of sheer willpower could he bring himself to conduct the examination. He was kind to them. He conversed with them about their life in the ghetto, about the sacrifice the boy's mother had paid in starving herself to death to provide them the additional scraps of food. After finishing their examination, Dr. Neasley offered them a warm meal, sparing them the knowledge that it would be their last. Within half an hour, Oberscharführer Musfeld returned, escorting them into the furnace room to undress. Dr. Neasley heard the Ober's revolver crack twice. Dr. Neasley's autopsy of the father and son would show nothing to verify Mengele's theories. Neasley bitterly expressed that their bodies could still easily be used to fuel Nazi propaganda. Having sent another 10,000 of the newly arrived men and women to their deaths in the gas chambers, Dr. Mengele arrived at the crematorium to listen to Dr. Neasley's report on the father and son. Mengele was determined not to have the bodies cremated and asked Dr. Neasley what methods could be used to preserve the skeletons. With Mengele considering the proposal of dissolving the flesh with chemicals as too time-consuming, he ordered the bodies to be cooked in boiling water. Offered only these simple instructions, Dr. Neasley put the question of finding a vessel large enough for the job to Oberscharführer Musfeld. Evidently, even Musfeld was horrified by Mengele's request. 2 large iron casks were procured within the camp and were placed over a bricked fire in the courtyard. After 5 hours of boiling, Dr. Neasley discovered that their flesh was softened enough to fall away from the bone. The fire was put out, and Dr. Neasley waited nearby for the casks to completely cool before removing the remains. As dusk began to fall, he was startled by an approaching summer commando. The man was screaming for him to hurry. Having finished their labor in the crematorium chimneys, a group of Polish prisoners had been waiting in the courtyard for their Nazi escort back to their barracks. While scrounging for food, they had happened upon the unguarded casks. They were eating the meat. Alerted to the nature of what kind of meat they had been eating, the Poles were sick, horrified, paralyzed. The skeletons were given a gasoline bath to dry them. Once finished, they were arranged on the same tables on which they had sat for their examination the prior evening. Dr. Mengele was highly pleased. He had brought several officers with him. They pompously examined certain parts of the skeletons and launched into high-sounding scientific terms, talking as if the 2 victims represented an extremely rare medical phenomenon. They abandoned themselves completely to their pseudoscience. Nazi propaganda never hesitated to cloth its monstrous lies in scientific apparel. The method often vaunted. Since those stories, these lies were directly portrayed, little or no critical faculty, and accepted as fact everything which bore the regime's stamp of approval. The skeletons Since the end of World War II, American military personnel have maintained a presence on the island Okinawa, the largest in the Ryukyu Island chain, now a prefecture of mainland Japan, and in 1945, the site of one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, with nearly equal numbers of soldiers and civilians perishing. Potentially due to its history of violent death, stories of supernatural encounters are common on the island. In fact, many American service members consider Okinawa the most haunted place in the U.S. military. What if ghosts and specters were not the only supernatural beings these men and women encountered? This is the story of the Kitsune. The Battle of Okinawa, occurring from April 1st until June 21st of 1945, was the last major battle of World War II, and one of the bloodiest. The combatants and civilians both endured grisly casualties as American forces attempted to root out a defending Japanese army from their many tunnels and fortifications. Approximately 7,500 U.S. Marines and soldiers and another 5,000 sailors were killed. Japan sacrificed even more men, at least 110,000 soldiers, with less than 8,000 Japanese soldiers surrendering, while many committed seppuku, a form of honorable and ritualistic suicide. Civilian death counts are undetermined, with some estimates as high as 160,000, more than a third of the island's population at the time. They were either caught in the crossfire between the two armies or died by the act of shudanjigetsu, or mass suicide. Suicide by civilians has been contested on some levels as to whether it occurred under the fanatical orders of the Japanese army or voluntarily due to anti-US propaganda which evoked civilian fear of torture or rape by their would-be American captors. Needless to say, violent death holds a significant spiritual presence on the island. Following the surrender of the Japanese Empire later that same year, Okinawa and the rest of the Ryukyu Islands were placed under American jurisdiction. With the signing of treaties occurring over the following decades, American military bases eventually became permanent installations on the island and remain so to this day under the U.S.-Japan Status of Forces Agreement. American occupation in Okinawa has remained a controversial issue, with the 1970 Koza riot against the U.S. military presence violently demonstrating such tensions between locals and U.S. personnel. To both the anger and approval of many Okinawans and Americans, the Okinawa Prefecture and Ryukyu Islands were ultimately reverted to Japan on May 15, 1972. The U.S. installations, however, remained as part of the international agreement. While infrequent incidents of drunken and criminal behavior on the part of U.S. personnel over the decades have largely contributed to these local tensions, the dangers and inconveniences of living near to several military bases, pollution, noise, and aircraft or airborne debris unintentionally killing residents and children crashing into homes and playgrounds, carries an additional portion of blame. Since the end of World War II, some among the local population have viewed this surrender of Okinawa by Japan as abandonment. Still, other locals continue to approve of both Okinawan independence as well as the incorporation of American culture. Throughout these last 70 years, with Okinawa serving as a military outpost, a jumping-off point for overseas deployments, expeditions, and other contingency operations in Southeast Asia, tens of thousands of American military personnel, Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen have likewise found themselves entrenched in Japanese culture, including its supernatural elements. The majority of supernatural encounters on Okinawa have been spectral in nature, with events such as hauntings being reported to occur in the same locations over the years, the stories even appearing in military newspapers. If we look to the many varieties of folklore and myths the world over, every culture has assigned specific human characteristics to certain animals, which they live in close proximity with, incorporating these animals into their stories and legends. The wise owl, the cunning serpent, the lone wolf. The sly fox is no exception. Throughout Chinese and Japanese lore, the fox, the kitsune, has been widely regarded as an intelligent being, one who possesses magical abilities that increase with age and accumulated wisdom. The more tales a kitsune has grown, the older, wiser, and more powerful it is. The Japanese term yokai is prescribed to supernatural entities, including the kitsune. According to yokai folklore, for instance, upon reaching a certain age, varying in folktales between ages 50 to 100, all kitsune acquire the ability to shapeshift into men, or, more commonly, beautiful and seductive young women. While medieval superstitions ran wild in Europe and America, with prosecutions and witch burnings occurring throughout the latter centuries of the second millennium, Japanese villagers feared crossing the path of a stray fox, or that of a lone woman in the evening, as she was presumed to be a fox in disguise. According to folklore historian Yue Gasal, the conviction that there are bakemono kitsune, bewitching foxes, has become so deeply ingrained in the Japanese that even in these modern enlightened times, few people will venture to pass a lonely spot, especially a graveyard or wood at night. They openly admit their fear of being bewitched. Nobody is ashamed of it, and if an uncomprehending foreigner laughs at the superstition, examples are immediately forthcoming of well-authenticated cases, or at least of people who knew people whose friend was once fooled by a fox. When a fox's weird yelping is heard at night, people crawl deep under their covers and pray that the beast may leave them in peace and pass on. In some parts of Japan, communities will not even use the word kitsune at night, fearing to call the powerful fox demon. They may use inari instead. Some tales speak of kitsune possessing incredible powers, able to bend time and space, drive people mad, or take fantastic shapes, such as a tree of incredible height or a second moon in the sky. Other kitsune have characteristics reminiscent of vampires or succubi, and feed on the life or spirit of human beings, generally through sexual contact, feeding on their victims while they sleep. Among other supernatural abilities, individuals who are known to be illiterate are said to suddenly acquire the ability to speak and write fluently, even in foreign languages. Folktales involving kitsune vary in their characterization, with some speaking of kitsune as tricksters, while other stories portray them as faithful guardians, friends, lovers, and even wives. These more kind-hearted supernatural fox spirits are often associated with one of the most important and powerful kami, or gods, named Inari, a prominent deity of fertility and prosperity in the Japanese Shinto religion. This association has reinforced the fox's supernatural significance throughout Japan. While many depictions of the kitsune are harmless or even benevolent, they are also believed to have demonic counterparts, a malevolent form of kitsune, a belief which has been attributed to very real Japanese historical accounts of illnesses and misfortunes being blamed on demonic possession, as well as violent retributions taken against the possessed individuals and their families. In fact, followers of the ancient Japanese religion of Shugendo still perform exorcisms on afflicted persons, attempting to cure them of symptoms or behaviors associated with kitsunetsuki, or the state of being possessed by a fox. With these ideas in mind, we are left to consider the island of Okinawa, steeped in chaos, haunted by so many violent deaths and unmarked graves, disturbed by a long-standing controversial occupation by foreign militaries, and a story of a young Marine during the Vietnam War, which suggests the potentially supernatural consequences. This story is not my own. It was told to me by my father on a drunken night when I was in my early 20s. I should say that the entire night was kind of weird when I think back on it. My father and I didn't have the best relationship, only really speaking on holidays. My mom had left when I was young, and I think I always blamed him. We still weren't talking much, but that was the longest we had hung out together without it devolving into a screaming match. Eventually, as I walked around the living room of my childhood home, looking at the relics of my past life, nostalgia, along with the buzz I was feeling, got the better of me. We started talking, mainly about people we hadn't thought of in years. Old friends, neighbors, the usual. The conversation grew quiet as we ran out of things to talk about. After a considerably longer period of silence, my dad caught my attention with a quiet cough. I realized he'd been staring at me, and the intensity in his eyes was unnerving. "You know I was in Vietnam, right? And that I spent some time in Okinawa?" he said. I nodded my head, noticing a slight feeling of apprehension creeping in. He took a few more long drags from his cigarette, and the look in his eyes seemed to darken. I half expected him to tell me I had a half-sibling in Asia. Now I kind of wish it was as simple as that. This story is kind of long, but here goes. This is the tale that I was told, as best I can recollect it. I hope you all enjoy it, or could possibly shed some light on the happenings that he and the men in his company witnessed or experienced firsthand. I should probably state here that he was a lance corporal in the Marines, as that may not be clear from the story itself. I wasn't that much older than you are now when I graduated boot camp and was shipped to Okinawa in the summer of '67 before heading to Vietnam. I didn't know what to expect between what I'd been trained to deal with and some of the things I heard from the guys on the base in Oki were saying. There were some pretty horrible stories coming out of the jungle, and yes, I was scared. But I was confident in myself and my brothers. I was also stupid. The first few days I was on Okinawa, I was restricted to base, as was anyone who had never been there before, so we didn't get into too much trouble. The first day I got a pass. One of the older guys took a group of us out to a nice bar where they specialized in making us feel comfortable. The girls there were good at their jobs, and so were the cooks. And that's not the point, just facts. We all started drinking sake and cutting up, and I was dumb enough to believe that my whole deployment was going to be alright. That night was fun, but nothing really happened. It was the second time that I went out, probably 3 or 4 days later, that I started to notice something a little off about the higher-priced girls. For one, a lot of the girls that worked there had minor skin problems or obvious bruises on them, but the high-dollar ones were clean and unblemished. They also spoke much better English than the other girls, even though they didn't look any older. Anyway, that was the first occasion that I decided to spend the night with one of those girls. I had the best dream of my life that night. I still remember walking by those snow-capped peaks in the countryside with her on my arm. I was disappointed when I woke up in the dark, kind of rank barracks the next morning and didn't remember exactly how I got back there. I figured I'd had too much to drink. Anyway, the day before we were supposed to head to Da Nang, we were told our company commander, our CO, got deathly ill. And we were also told that our further deployment was on hold. Stuff like that happened, so we didn't think much of it. I spent quite a bit of time at the bar, but I didn't spend the night with the women every time. Some of the time I just wanted to drink, and their whiskey and cigarettes were cheap. But it was after my 4th trip to the bar that something happened to a friend of mine. Also, that was the night I asked one of the girls why none of the local Japanese boys ever came in. She brushed it off with something about the place just being for American GIs. Anyway, that night the bar was packed. The guys were dancing, drinking, and basically just blowing off steam. I was in the corner with a few guys from my platoon. Jameson, a big Irish American with a typical Boston accent, was being his loud and obnoxious self. And Eddie and I were laughing at his BS stories between mouthfuls of warm beer. Piss water, Jamie called it. We had already waved off a few of the girls who'd come around, trying to make their money, when I saw a familiar figure walking toward us, flanked by a pair of girls just as flawlessly beautiful as she was. Eddie was the first one of us to give in. He slipped me some cash to help pay for the drinks. Jameson drifted away next, leaving me and the woman, who I was starting to consider a friend, alone in the booth together. As she helped me finish drinking the beer that was left in the pitcher, and after taking my money, she eventually ordered me upstairs to one of the private rooms, me being too drunk to resist anymore. I again woke up in my barracks with no memory of my return trip. That morning, while I was nursing myself through breakfast and mainly just drinking coffee, I noticed that Jameson hadn't showed up. I went back to the squad bay and checked his rack, his bed, and was surprised to find his stuff still there, but the big guy nowhere to be found. I thought maybe he'd gotten a 2-day pass or stayed at the club the night before and hadn't made it back yet, so I didn't worry too much. I showed up to work with Eddie, and we started our daily routine, helping the guys in logistics load and unload trucks mainly. Jamie still had not showed up by the time we were finishing lunch, and so I figured I should mention it to someone. Before going back to work, I found our lieutenant in his office. I asked about Jameson's past situation, and he pulled the logbook out of his desk, checking the roster. Apparently, he had been given a 2-day pass. That explained it, or, that's what I thought. We went out again that night. I was standing in the line, waiting to get into the place with some of the other Marines, smoking and chatting about nothing in particular, when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt like I was being watched, so I started glancing around. I was about to turn back and say something to Eddie when I finally saw the guy, about a half a block away, standing at the entrance to a narrow alley and staring right at me. He was short, wearing a Japanese army uniform. We made eye contact, and instead of looking away, he motioned for me to walk over to him. I'm not sure why, but I made up some excuse and split off from the group. I could just sense the guy wasn't going to start trouble. As I got closer, I could see that he looked scared, or maybe angry, but certainly not threatening. I offered him a cigarette, and he took one, again motioning for me to follow him, this time down the alley. I stayed a few paces behind him just in case, and then he turned and opened an unmarked, barely painted metal door. Obviously a restaurant, the smell of cooking fish and rice wafting out. He ushered me into the kitchen, urging me to sit at a small, cheap table that had an overflowing ashtray and wet rings all over the top. From the looks of it, this was where the cooks took their breaks. He disappeared for a few minutes, then came back carrying a couple of bottles of beer. He handed one to me before he sat down across the table. He was about my age, but the set of his jaw and the look in his eyes told me that he had probably already seen things that would have turned me into a gibbering mess. "How long have you been going to that club?" he asked me. I was more astonished by his lack of accent than anything else. I told him I'd been there a few times and that I enjoyed the music as well as the company of the staff there. He nodded as I sipped at my drink, and I could see him trying to organize his thoughts. I thought about getting up and leaving, starting to feel slightly awkward in the unfamiliar place by myself. I was halfway through a swig of beer when he broke the silence. "Have any of your friends gone missing yet?" I put down my beer. The question made me pause because I immediately thought about Jameson. Since I hadn't gotten into the club across the street yet to see if he was in there, I just shook my head. But I was still a little freaked out that he had asked such a question. "Just be careful over there," he said, and stood up, giving me a bow and sending me on my way after I finished my drink. He might not have believed me. Maybe the look on my face gave me away. Anyway, I walked back to the club, finding Eddie just a bit closer to the door than when I'd left him. Pretty soon we were inside, being ushered over to the booth that, by now, had become pretty much our regular spot. We ordered food and a pitcher of beer, and I was now feeling a bit edgy. I remember looking around, trying to find a few more familiar faces. The Japanese guy had made me kind of paranoid, so I wanted as many people as possible that I knew to be around me, at least that night. As our group expanded, I started to relax, especially when, lo and behold, I saw Jameson coming down the stairs from the private rooms. He joined us and even had a couple of drinks, but there was something wrong with him. It was like his personality was a little bit forced. It was like he was trying too hard to be his loud, obnoxious self. Things were weird enough as it was, so I ended up dragging him away from the group outside and handed him a cigarette before asking him, "What the hell is up with you tonight?" Well, clearly he hadn't expected that kind of question, and he suddenly looked at me like he'd been caught doing something. He recovered himself a bit and just said, "What do you mean? I'm fine, man. Just a bit hungover and tired." I didn't feel like I should press the issue, so I accepted his explanation and we smoked in silence before we headed back inside. Eddie had disappeared from the booth. When I asked, I was told that one of the pricier girls had come by and swept him away. That was pretty typical, but now, what with that Japanese guy had said at the back of my mind, I was feeling jumpy, slightly worried about my friends. I quit drinking early that night and got a lift back to the base with a couple of guys who were probably way more smashed than I was. Thank God we didn't wreck the car on our way back. I went to sleep feeling concerned, but hoping that we would be leaving the island soon. No such luck, since we found out that morning that the commander apparently took a turn for the worse. Although there was some talk about us being shuffled around to get more bodies into the jungle. Thing is, Jameson didn't show up for work that day, either. With his 2-day pass being expired, me and Eddie covered for him when they took names at formation. Well, it turns out our lieutenant noticed. With Jameson being expected back, the LT had been looking for him. He pulled me aside after formation to ask where he was. I told him Jameson was likely hungover in his rack. Probably should have said he was at medical. He let it go, but told me to forward a message. He suspended Jameson's off-base privileges and wanted to speak with him first thing the next day. Remember when I told you I was stupid? Well, despite my concerns, I found myself going back to the bar a little earlier than usual that day. We got released early since the supply shipment was delayed and we had nothing to do. But of course, I also wanted to look for Jameson. We could only lie so much before he was accused of going AWOL. Eddie joined me in going to the bar again, but Jameson was there before us, sitting in the booth. To
be honest, it looked like he'd been there all night and hadn't slept. If I could trust my instincts, something was very wrong. He looked worse than he had the day before, so I told him he looked like hell. "I think I caught something," he said before hacking into a piece of cloth that was blotted in red stains. When he pulled the cloth away, I saw another dime-sized spot of fresh blood. Maybe he caught whatever our CO had. After we showed up, Jamie said he wanted to head back to the base to see what was wrong with him. I wanted to ask him why he hadn't gone to medical sooner, but that's a Marine for you. Me and Eddie decided that he shouldn't go back on his own, so we decided to get him a cab and make sure he made it to see a corpsman. On our way outside, I glanced toward the alley where the soldier had been standing before, but the street was pretty much deserted since it was early. Jameson's repeated disappearances and now his decline in health had me spooked. Was this what the Japanese guy was talking about? And if anything, I thought maybe Jamie's food or beer was being poisoned or something. He was a bit obnoxious when he drank, and a lot of locals didn't exactly like having us there. Can't imagine why. But I got the feeling that the Japanese guy knew something about it, and I'd have to find him and ask when I had time. The taxi, we called them honchos, wasn't licensed to drive on the base, so we had to walk from the front gate. Since the barracks was in the opposite direction, Eddie offered to escort Jameson to medical, so I spent the rest of the evening writing letters and decided I would check on Jameson in the morning. All things considered, I slept pretty well that night, and for the first time since I'd met the gorgeous local girl at the club, I didn't dream about her. Actually, I might not have dreamt at all. I don't remember most dreams, but it was significant because it was the first time that week that I hadn't dreamt about her. I'd been looking forward to it. I also noticed that despite a good sleep, I felt a little bit off the next day. Not sick exactly, just sluggish. I thought maybe I caught what Jamie had. I was kind of tired the whole day, as if my energy had been drained as soon as my eyes had opened. During our morning formation, a few names were called that would be shipping off to Da Nang. I wasn't one of them, and neither was Eddie. After formation, I told Eddie to cover for me and headed over to medical. To my surprise, Jameson had checked himself out. In fact, he had ripped out his IV and apparently left in the middle of the night without telling anybody. The cots were uncomfortable, so the corpsman figured he went back to his barracks to sleep. I checked. He wasn't there. So I went to the front gate and checked the logbook. I could see where we signed him back in, but there was no signature for him leaving. In any case, he wouldn't have been allowed off base, what with not having a renewed Liberty Pass. I figured, and it worried me, that he must have snuck off base, either jumping a fence or finding some other way. The girls at the bar were cute, but with how weak he looked, I couldn't figure out how or why he would go to such lengths just to get back there. But where else would he have gone? As soon as I was able to, I left the base, heading for the club. I figured explaining my paranoia to Eddie would be too weird, so this time I went alone. Before leaving, I stopped by the squad bay to grab something. My pistol. Our issued weapons were kept at the armory, but luckily, someone told me to pack out a pistol from home, since he said the .45s I gave you would blow your ears out. Well, they would probably court-martial me if I was caught taking a gun off base, but I felt a lot safer going alone with it. It was early. The place was practically empty. I didn't see Jameson. None of the staff were very helpful either. Not knowing what else to do, I went back outside, and my feet took me back to that alley. The soldier wasn't there, but rather than turning back, I walked back down the alley, the same dingy metal door. I tried opening it, but wasn't surprised to find it locked. Figuring I'd try to go around the front, I turned to walk back up the alley and practically collided with a Japanese soldier, who had apparently walked up behind me without making a sound. He apologized for startling me and then raised his hand and knocked twice on the kitchen door, yelling something I didn't understand in Japanese. The door opened and a short old man wearing a suit stared at us with mild interest before he puttered off. He walked me to a private booth on the actual dining floor this time and ordered for both of us. Meanwhile, we made small talk and I was trying to figure out what to even ask that didn't seem accusatory. After a server dropped the beers off, the soldier stared at me for a few seconds.
"So, what brings you back here?"
He asked, and now that I was paying attention, I was kind of surprised at how well he spoke English without any trace of an accent. Figuring I'd be straightforward, I told him about Jameson. When he heard it, his whole demeanor changed noticeably. He went from somewhat relaxed to, pensive, anxious, even a little bit angry. Whatever it was, his mood didn't brighten when I told him my theories about the whole situation. Although his face shifted slightly when I mentioned the possibility of the food and alcohol being poisoned. He said nothing. With nothing else to do for it, we ordered a few more beers, and to get the conversation going, I reverted to small talk. His name was Brian, and he had been born in the States and had even went to school there for much of his youth, which explained the fluent English as well as his American name. When we were a few beers in, I thought I would press my luck, now that he seemed more open to talking. He still hesitated, but quietly told me that he had a theory about the people running the place, and that they might be killing or enslaving people, but he was having a hard time getting information. Apparently, people kept disappearing. I began to understand his anxiety in telling me this. He was worried he might disappear too. I thought about it for a bit and volunteered to poke around later that night. He resisted, but eventually agreed, telling me, "This is my father's place. Just tell the cooks you know me if they give you trouble, and stop coming through the front door." With that, we parted ways. I headed back outside to find a line queuing up in front of the bar. I hopped in and waited to get inside with the rest, hoping Jameson might have showed up. I didn't see Jamie anywhere. I saw the girl he normally spent time with, and she said she hadn't seen him either. Since the bar was more crowded than usual and I wanted a better view of the place, I sat at the bar. Feeling a bit anxious, I was happy when another guy joined me. He was a talker. I let him prattle on while I mulled over how to begin my investigation. Not unexpectedly, I felt a familiar female form pressing up against my upper back. I'd nearly forgotten how stunning she was. Hell, I'm pretty sure I forgot about Jameson as soon as I made eye contact with her. Still, I did my best to play hard to get for a while, ordering more beer, drinking, and making her do the same before letting her convince me to rent a room for the night. Sometime later, after we had finished, I feigned sleep for a bit while listening to her breathing until I was convinced that she was well asleep. I eased my way out of the bed and slipped into my clothing in the dark. I grabbed her garments and made for the private bathroom, closing the door and going through her belongings. I didn't find anything suspicious. I put the stuff back the way I'd found it and slipped out of the room, following the hall back to the stairs. I went back down into the club, which was practically shut down. Only one bartender was on duty and a pair of cooks played cards at a table, smoking and talking loudly. I couldn't do anything with the bartender watching me, so I ordered a few drinks, which I poured quietly onto the floor. I wanted to keep my wits about me. After supplying me with my third drink, the bartender gave me my opportunity, disappearing in the direction of the bathroom. I made sure the card players weren't paying attention, then slid off the stool, acting as if I were going to the same place, then ducking through the door into the kitchen. I looked around, but saw nothing that looked out of the ordinary. I walked to the freezer. Perfect place to hide a body, I thought. I opened the door and looked inside. They had meat on the hooks, but I'm pretty sure it was pork. Nothing weird, so I walked back out, closing the door. Not wanting to be caught by the bartender, I was about to give up, at least for that night, when I noticed a door in the back wall, leading to what I would discover to be a root cellar. The door was slightly ajar. Feeling apprehensive as all hell, my bad judgment won out as my feet carried me through the doorway, which opened onto a staircase. The smell of damp earth and some kind of spices intensified as I walked down the wooden steps, listening as hard as I could for the sound of the bartender, or anyone else for that matter. When I reached the landing and tried to light my Zippo in the dark, that was when I heard it. I tried my damn lighter, it startled me so bad. It wasn't the bartender's footsteps. It was a muffled scream. It sounded a good distance away, so I made my way toward the back wall of the cellar, found a trap door, which was open. Son, until that point, that was the most scared I had ever been. For close to a full minute, I debated on whether or not just to turn around and run back up the stairs. Again, bad judgment making won out over cowardice, and I slid down into the opening, dropping about 6 feet down. Compared to the root cellar above, you could tell that the digging here had been done recently. The smell of fresh earth was so heavy in the air you could feel it in your throat and lungs. On a side note, I can't tell you how happy I was not to have been a tunnel rat in Vietnam. Having heard the stories from the guys coming back, I thought that's what this was. Viet Cong bringing the fight to Okinawa right under our feet. Or maybe some old Japanese fighters still in hiding, carrying on with that war. Hell, I didn't know what to think. I heard the scream again, and this time I could tell it was a man's scream. And there was agony in the sound. A sound I became very familiar with when I finally did start swapping lead with the Viet Cong, watching everyone around me getting ripped apart, dropping like flies. Anyway, I wasn't sure what I was dealing with, slowly walking down that dirt tunnel, expecting to find some kind of torture room, I suppose. I followed the cries, pulling my pistol out of my waistband. I had a million horror scenarios flashing through my mind as I moved through that tunnel. But I had to do something. The man screamed again, much closer now. There were lights strung along the tunnel when I came around a bend in the path. This portion of tunnel looked much older, probably used by the Japanese army. But that's when I heard the man's ragged sobs between the louder cries. I knew that voice. It was Jameson, and he was begging for his life. I didn't even realize that I'd stopped moving until he screamed again. I knew he needed help. He was dying. But somehow, I stopped myself from acting too quickly. I wasn't sure how many enemies I might be dealing with. I'd heard about booby traps in the jungles. As I slowly approached another entrance to a room off the tunnel, I could tell Jameson was just inside that room. I snuck up to the side of the entrance. Couldn't help but notice that, along with my buddy's voice, I distinctly heard something else under the sound of screaming and crying. It was grotesque. I pressed myself to the wall and peeked through the doorway. I recoiled immediately. To this day, I still struggle to make sense of what I saw. It haunts me. My friend and squad mate, Jameson, had been strapped to a table. His face was ripped apart, covered in blood. If it was not for his voice, I would not have recognized him. His clothes were tattered and soaked in blood. The next thing I'm going to tell you is something I have never told anyone, son. Well, you'll be the second. It was not a human who had done this to my friend. The thing in the room was a fox, but it was standing like a man on its two hind legs. It also had several tails, maybe 3 of them. I don't know what the hell it was, but it was eating my friend alive. I raised my pistol as I swung wide through the door, squeezing the trigger as I approached the monster from behind. The first bullet struck to the side of the thing's spine, just under the shoulder blade. It didn't go down, and I squeezed the trigger 3 more times as it turned toward me with a whimpering growl. One of the shots missed, but the third smacked home into the creature's ribs. That time, it let out a pained yelp and dropped to a knee. Then it charged. I managed to get off another 2 rounds in its stomach before it hit me. It knocked the gun out of my hand, and somehow I managed to avoid its claws. Probably should have let him slash me, at least least then I'd have scars to prove it. Obviously, it was strong as hell, but I think my bullets weakened it enough to give me an edge. I managed to land a hard kick to its skull with my boot, then lunged for my pistol. Whatever it was quick. It was out of the room and down the tunnel before I could take aim again. I'm not sure if I was more pissed or scared. Might have chased after it, but I knew Jamie didn't have much time. I untied him, bandaged him as best I could using my shirt and jacket. He was bleeding so much. I'm still not sure how I got him back out of those tunnels. I just started screaming for help when I got to the street. Some of the shop owners came out, must have had apartments or their stores. That guy Brian showed up as well. Anyway, they called for an ambulance. I kept pressure on Jameson's wounds. In the confusion, the police seemed to show up before I could even consider how ridiculous my story sounded. I think Brian picked up on that when I looked at him. None of the cops really spoke English anyway. As they were loading Jameson into the ambulance, I heard Brian telling the police something in Japanese. I still don't know what he said, but can you guess what the official story was? Attacked by dogs. Well, they were half right. But without any proof, I knew if I tried to tell them the truth, they'd chuck me in the loony bin. Hell, you probably think I'm crazy too. Law enforcement was pretty loose, or maybe they figured whatever Brian told them was enough, but the cops left me there. Didn't ask me to come down to the station and make a statement or anything. No idea. I followed Brian back into his dad's restaurant after the cops and ambulance left. He asked me what happened. I told him everything. I couldn't help but notice he didn't seem surprised, or even skeptical. It's like he expected something like this, like giant fox monsters or run-of-the-mill around that island. All he said is that I'd done enough, and he would take care of the rest. I told him I wanted in on whatever he was planning, but he shut me down, telling me to go back to the base and to sit tight. He gave me a beer before he left, and I thought about following him, but for the first time in a couple weeks, I chose to do the smart thing and to stay out of it. I went back to the base and reported the incident, told them Jameson was being taken to a hospital. I left out the part about the fox. Not that I could have slept that night, even if I'd wanted to, but around 4 a.m. a lot of guys were awakened by what was the distinct sound of an explosion in the distance. Like me in the tunnel, everyone thought maybe the enemy was somehow bringing the fight to Okinawa, which made no sense, and that notion was quickly dispelled. A few hours later, we were standing in full battalion formation, and we were missing a few guys from our platoon, not just Jameson. Apparently, the explosion had been the bar being blown to smithereens. Killed all of the guys sleeping with the girls upstairs, including Eddie. Took out a good part of the buildings around it too, apparently. Never did see it. They restricted us to base from then on. I never heard from Brian again. Never found out what happened. The incident was covered up. Gas leak, they told us. Maybe that's how Brian did it. Opened the gas lines in the kitchen. I was probably the only one who knew anything about it. And I figured saying anything might incriminate me, just make things worse. Jameson went into a coma. Too much blood loss. He didn't make it. It was then that I stopped making new friends. Good thing, too. I would have lost a lot more once I got to Vietnam. I shipped out the day after I found out about Jameson's death. I saw things in that jungle that were horrible. But it was never enough to make me forget about that thing in the tunnels. I have never told anyone else this story. But I have to admit, it feels good to get it off my chest. After he stopped talking, he was quiet for a long time. I finally thanked him and let the story sink in as I went to sleep. I have never checked out anything he told me, but I just wanted to share the story with you guys, as I thought you'd all enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Okay, all right. First few days I was on Okinawa, I was restricted to base, as was anyone who'd never been there before. I can't do that. I'm over it. I'm done. I just can't. I can't. I don't know what it is about tonight, but I just don't want to fucking do this, man. Don't want to fucking do this. God dang, dude. I was halfway through a swig of beer when he broke the silence. It's just not there. It's not there. I can't, I want to keep that graveliness going, but I just can't. It's like maybe I can. I just gotta keep coughing. Okay. He nodded as I sipped at my drink, and I could see him trying to organize his thoughts.